Night had fallen on one of the ordinary cities, and there were no signs hinting at the events that were about to unfold. A massive crack appeared in the sky, resembling a hole in a window or a mirror after a large stone had been thrown. Streams of blue energy began to flow as if from a magnificent waterfall. The city's inhabitants, mesmerized, watched this sight that was both beautiful and terrifying. A small child stepped out onto the balcony, unable to sleep, and was drawn to the bright light shining through the window. The child called out to her mother to witness the wonder happening from her room. The energy, later known as mana, affected humans. It was this mana that enabled a few chosen individuals to awaken and discover their extraordinary powers. The mana storm, as it was called, ended as abruptly as it had appeared in the night sky. Only the huge crack in the sky remained to remind everyone of this inexplicable phenomenon. Similar events occurred worldwide, and people became accustomed to these awakenings. However, alongside the emergence of individuals with superpowers, there also appeared a significant threat to the world. The military warned citizens not to approach the gates that suddenly opened in the middle of the street. A guard noticed a change in the hum of the gate, which did not bode well. The portal's color shifted from a calming blue to a blood red, and ominous sounds warned of impending danger. Finally, a giant creature emerged from the gate, a cross between a giant and a demon, its body adorned with various marks. It turned out to be a true giant, 10 times larger than an ordinary human. The military was powerless against this colossal foe. The people gathered at the gate fled in panic from the monster that appeared. It wasn't long before the giant left only bloodstains on the street from the soldiers. Spectators who had previously been curiously recording the opening of the gate now ran in terror, calling for help. Only one person walked against the crowd, standing firm in such a situation as if dealing with similar gates was a daily routine for him. The man was unafraid of the red light or the size of the monster emerging from the gate. The transformed giant raised its club above the man who dared to challenge him. The man looked at the deadly threat with a smile, not even considering fleeing the battlefield. Shin hoped to change his life after he awakened. The man ran through an ice cave, with threatening sounds from the strange creature echoing behind him. He turned to see his pursuer and tried to assess how much the situation had spiraled out of control. The ice monster chased the man, and it was only a few steps before the giant and Shin were finished. The boy thought he only wanted to live peacefully where no one could steal from or hit him, but all his allies died horribly. They had nothing to combat this unexpected threat. Shin created a magical sword in his hand and turned to face the monster. He hurled the dagger with all his might at the giant ice monster, hoping to inflict even the slightest damage. However, the sword merely bounced off the monster's thick skin made of pure ice. The magical weapon ricocheted off the creature's body and stuck to the ceiling of the ice cave. The monster quickened its pace, intending to finish Shin with one strike. The monster missed, slamming its massive claw into the ground beside the man with tremendous force. Thick cracks spread across the ground beneath the hero's feet. Finally, the ground beneath the man's feet opened up, and he fell into the forming chasm. As he fell, Shin wished for one true friend in his short life. With a high splash, he plunged into a small lake at the bottom of the hidden underground cave. Instinctively, Shin tried to take a deep breath, but of course, this wasn't possible underwater. His consciousness slowly faded as he felt close to his last breath. Suddenly, a bright blue light appeared before his eyes, and the flow of mana captured his attention. The ice monster left the battlefield, thinking it had successfully defeated the man who troubled it. However, the sound from the chasm created by its strike made the monster turn back. The creature wasn't very intelligent, but even it understood that its enemy seemed to be rising to the surface. Meanwhile, Shin emerged from the lake and crossed the distance from the pool to the hole in the ground using a weapon made of pure energy as a foothold. When he reached the surface, Shin froze in front of the giant ice monster. The monster raised its hands above the man's head, trying to finish him off once and for all. But Shin did not want to die helpless. His eyes were filled with blue light from mana. Suddenly, dozens of blades pierced the monster's body, created by the boy's ability. Those sharp energy blades practically split the monster in two, leaving deep wounds all over its body. The monster fell on its back, struck by Shin's unexpected and powerful attack. The man, almost out of strength, stood over the defeated monster's body, trying to comprehend the last few minutes that had passed. Suddenly, the monster's eyes flared with fire and its body began to move. Shin's defensive reaction didn't take long. Without realizing it, he again used the mana flowing through his veins. Dozens of energy blades appeared around him, ready to finish off the ice monster once and for all. After the final seconds of the fight, a mysterious interface appeared in front of Shin's eyes, informing him that the conditions to become a player had been met. Wearing ordinary sneakers, Shin passed through the dense forest. He was almost exhausted but did not stop on his journey toward his goal. Finally, Shin ran to the place where two young people were already waiting for him. The girl was skilled at dealing damage in close combat, and the man in armor acted as a tank, with heavy armor visible on his back. The knight said that he was also late on his first mission when he was young. Shin apologized for being late, sweat dripping from his forehead, and he could barely breathe. However, his companions reassured him, saying he was only a few minutes late and the campaign had not yet started. Shin was worried. He had only joined the guild 3 months ago and was already late for his first flying mission. The group moved toward the gate, and the knight and the girl discussed what they would do after completing the mission. For Shin, this was his first dungeon exploration as support, and it was important for him to prove his usefulness not only to the team but also to the group as a whole. At the entrance to the dungeon, Shin met the group leader, an experienced hunter with half of his face hidden behind a cloth mask. Moon Do-yoon asked if Shin had ever participated in a mission like this before or if this was his first attempt. Shin replied that he had been to several dungeons as an assistant, but this was his first time as support. Moon Do-yoon explained that Shin should keep an ideal distance. If too close to the center of the battle, there was a high chance he would suffer severe damage. If too far, the team would not have time to help him, and the consequences would be dire. Moon Do-yoon asked Shin to stay alert and use his skills in weapon creation. The group leader was an assassin, and he asked Shin to make a dagger. With only a gesture needed and nothing more, Shin was just in a situation to clarify whether it was necessary to make weapons for the rest of the group. However, the assassin assured him that the dungeon was not difficult and Shin need not worry too much, as only one would receive enough support. The mage asked the group to stop and activated a skill to search for living creatures and sense the monsters ahead. Moon Do-yoon ordered them to prepare for battle, hold the line, and watch the situation closely. The assassin asked the mage to explain the number of creatures sensed and the level of monsters awaiting them. The mage sensed 3 small auras and 1 large enough to be the dungeon boss. Moon Do-yoon asked Shin how long it would take to make a dagger, and the man answered that it would take about a second. The assassin asked him to start making it because, in 1 second, he planned to deal with the boss with his skill. Finally, the team reached a room guarded by a giant crystal lizard, and the creature saw the hunters and immediately attacked. They wanted to tear the invaders apart. Immediately, the tank prepared to withstand the attack, and the girl heated her fists, planning to fight well. The knight activated a skill, and a stream of energy covered his entire body. A clicking sound like electricity was heard in the air. Finally, the skill was ready, enhancing the tank's attributes and lifting his shield above his head. In 1 second, he lowered the shield forcefully and stuck it to the ground, and a shockwave spread throughout the room, scattering the lizards in different directions. The girl did not stay idle. She was ready for action, jumping and preparing a powerful punch, her fist whistling through the air. Finally, she unleashed all her strength on the unfortunate lizard's face standing in her way. Lucy performed a stunning acrobatic move, leaping over the unconscious monster's body. Her punch so powerful that when she landed, the monster's body was still suspended in the air. The girl turned to check on the others and saw that the lizard she had struck had already recovered and, along with the other opponents, was preparing to attack the tank. The monsters quickly closed the distance. The girl warned of the impending attack and shouted to draw the attention of her allies. The knight took a defensive position, and the wizard began to chant a spell. A fireball appeared in the wizard's upraised palm. He shouted in an unfamiliar language and started to attack. Dozens of fireballs exploded from the wizard's hands and flew toward the attacking monsters. The room was illuminated by the bright light from the powerful explosions created by the spell. The fire's temperature was so high that it left only the ashes of the lizards floating in the air for a moment before gently falling to the ground. The wizard rejoiced, as he always worried in such critical moments because the fate of the entire team depended on her. Shin thought that the team acted very cohesively, like members of the same guild. A magical dagger formed in his hands, and the hilt was almost ready. The assassin urged him to hurry, and Shin thought that this was not the time to be distracted by the team's actions. Finally, the weapon was ready. Shin held the dagger by its hilt and checked the quality of the blade. He shouted to Moon Do-yoon that he had finished crafting the item and threw the weapon towards the assassin. Moon Do-yoon slightly twisted to follow the weapon with his eyes and deftly caught the blade in his hand. A dark flash flowed from the hilt to the blade as the assassin used a special skill to enhance the weapon. The blade finally emitted a powerful aura as if the object were made of pure shadow energy. Moon Do-yoon closed the distance, running toward the boss, and prepared for a lethal blow. The assassin made a quick leap, and with a slight movement of the shadow weapon, he slit the giant lizard's throat. The beheaded head fell behind the sly assassin with a perfect strike. The weapon melted in the captain's hand, the shadow energy being so powerful that it made the weapon a one-time use item. The team gathered and asked each other if there were any casualties, but in this battle, there were no fatalities and not even any injuries. Shin felt he was in a good environment and had not even expected each of them to have such skills. He was very impressed by the well-coordinated teamwork that allowed them to complete the battle quickly and effectively. Shin felt useless compared to them. He barely influenced the outcome. He blamed himself for almost not having enough time to make even one dagger and being distracted by others' actions. Shin thought he hardly deserved to be in such a coordinated team, and his skills were very weak. Shin was awakened from his heavy thoughts by the voice of Moon Do-yoon asking if he was okay. Shin felt embarrassed and said that he survived thanks to the team's actions and that he was practically useless. However, Moon Do-yoon ignored Shin's doubts and said that thanks to his weapon-making skills, he saved a lot of money. Although the shadow enhancement caused significant damage, it absorbed the weapon after one use, so the assassin thanked Shin for saving resources and ensuring he didn't have to worry. He praised Shin for his help, especially on his first successful mission in the dungeon. The assassin needed a team member with weapon-making skills and asked Shin not to give up and to continue improving his skills. The tank cut the conversation short and proposed to start collecting loot and return home. Suddenly, the walls of the dungeon shook and the heroes could barely stand. The wizard warned that the cave might begin to collapse after the boss was destroyed and that the team needed to hurry. Shin noticed something and pointed with his finger, his voice drowned out by the rumble of the earthquake. The team turned and saw a section of the ice wall collapsing under the vibrations and revealing a path. The wizard lit the way with his staff and carefully inspected the open area. After finishing his analysis, he turned to the team and said that the path connected to the cave's interior. The team leader thought about the wizard's words and looked at the opening, doubting whether it was worth exploring the mysterious path. However, the tank was already imagining the treasures located at the end of that secret cave and wanted to explore it. The girl joined in and offered to quickly check what was hidden on the newly opened path. The wizard reported that he didn't sense the aura of a single living creature ahead. The team leader gave in to the team's insistence and thought there was no harm in gathering additional loot. The wizard didn't fully agree with the leader's decision, but he agreed to continue the journey into the cave. The assassin invited the new character to join, thinking that the additional treasure would benefit the entire team. The team casually stepped into the open entrance, excited about the chance to earn extra money. Suddenly, the terrifying mask of an ice giant appeared out of nowhere, shocking the entire team. Shin screamed to flee from the golem chasing them ever faster. Shin could not understand how he could survive. He couldn't believe that such a dangerous opponent appeared in a low-level dungeon. Shin's team of heroes was crushed in an instant. Furthermore, the wizard hadn't even sensed such a strong enemy inside the dungeon. As he continued to run, Shin slightly turned to see how far he was, but the ice golem chased behind him, ready to capture its prey. The monster used a powerful skill and slammed the ground in front of it. The force of the blow was so great that Shin was swept away by the energy wave and lost his balance. Shin fell backward, hitting the ground with his back, and blood splattered from his mouth. Struggling to get up, Shin rested on his right hand and nearly lost consciousness. The golem kept chasing, and the distance between them quickly closed. With the last of his strength, Shin created a weapon with his skill, trying to fight the monster by any means. The sorcerer didn't strike the hero's golem directly but instead hit the ground beneath it, creating a large chasm that caused Shin to fall, knocking the wind out of him. The hero could only let out a desperate sigh. He fell into an underground tank, feeling despair as his low level prevented him from using healing skills. Shin choked on the icy water, realizing that this was how the death he had most feared would come. The comrades he had just met flashed before his eyes. Shin thought he had found the team he needed, but he wasn't good enough to save them. The hero thought it might be better not to wake up since he had disappointed so many people. Suddenly, an interface appeared before the hero's eyes, indicating that he had met all the requirements to become a player. A bright light illuminated the underground tank, and a mysterious power filled the man's body. He tried to breathe in the water, but only bubbles came out of his mouth. The interface informed the player that a reward awaited for completing the mission, and the hero barely understood what was happening. Shin tried to take another breath, but the icy water only flowed into his lungs. Without comprehending whether this was reality or the illusion of death, the hero decided to accept the reward. He tried to press the right button on the floating interface before his eyes with the last of his strength. He reached out his hand as his body sank deeper into the abyss of darkness. Still able to use the interface, a flow of mana allowed Shin to create a ladder from weapons formed by his skills. The hero appeared before the ice monster he thought he had defeated, but it seemed Shin was starting to regain his strength with the help of a sudden second wind. The golem let out a loud roar of anger, clearly displeased with the outcome of the battle. The hero's eyes glowed blue, and fear and despair were replaced by determination to destroy the enemy. In an instant, Shin created a nest of energy swords that quickly flew toward the monster. The blades pierced the golem's body, causing massive damage, and the monster fell on its back. Shin held his head, something strange happening within his body and mind. Hundreds of memories filled the hero's brain suddenly, and he couldn't understand where they came from. A loud noise distracted the hero from his thoughts. He lifted his bloodshot eyes and saw the golem launching a new attack, raising its massive fist. The monster's hand came down, and Shin wouldn't have survived the blow if not for the magic shield he managed to create just before the deadly strike. landed. The man wondered how he could remain unharmed against such a powerful creature, but the hero's skills were too weak to withstand the ancient monster's strength for long, and the shield shattered into pieces. Shin narrowly avoided the monster's threatening fist, leaping to a safe distance. Memories from a previous life told the man that this type of golem had no specific weaknesses. As if to confirm the hero's thoughts, the monster launched a new attack with a loud roar. The man's eyes turned turquoise again, seemingly connecting with a network to read data. The only way to defeat the golem was by using network skills. In this case, traps were set around the monster, allowing him to damage it from all sides simultaneously. The golem was easily trapped and entered the energy cage in an attempt to close the distance. Shin seized the opportunity and clenched his fist, commanding the magic swords to attack the monster. Dozens of swords hovered above the ice golem and sped up, rushing toward the enemy. The cave space lit up with a bright light as if a powerful explosion had occurred within the cunning trap. The monster shattered into pieces, its head separated from its body with a look of surprise frozen on its face. Barely surviving the uneven battle, the hero approached the defeated enemy's body and sighed. He had never used network skills offensively before and thought his abilities had significantly improved. An interface appeared before Shin's eyes, allowing the hero to view information about the dungeon or the monster. Suddenly, a purple energy mass emerged above the defeated enemy and was carefully examined by the hero. The mass smoothly flowed into the hero's hand, forming a perfectly round bubble in his palm. The system informed Shin that he had activated the passive mana absorption skill. Gradually, memories from another life began to emerge in the hero's mind, seemingly from the future. He saw himself standing in the middle of a city street in 2 years, destroyed either by powerful magic or disaster. The setting sun cast its first rays on the ruined buildings that seemed to have shifted from their usual places. The vision showed the terrifying impact of a disaster. The world had fallen, and the defenders of humanity were clearly losing the battle against an unknown enemy. Shin thought that this might be a vision of the future, but the flow of events didn't necessarily have to repeat in reality. He used the interface to view the list of available options and pondered the upcoming disaster he might be able to prevent. Finally, Shin acknowledged that he had become a gambler, identified as a rare representative of future hunters who would be summoned as chosen players. However, at this moment, their existence was not yet known. Based on the hero's new memories, in 2 years, the first awakened players would appear. The system introduced these superhumans not only with a graphical interface but also with various skill or performance enhancements. Sometimes players also received rewards like chests containing artifacts never seen before, leading to rapid progress in their own development and the growth of the guilds they joined. In the future, the hero did not become one of the chosen, but the presence of such individuals in his guild motivated him to train harder and achieve success. Shin noted that, as he suspected, the system was well suited to his observational skills and the amount of experience he had gained. A scale appeared before the hero's eyes, showing the amount of mana absorbed, but the man decided to think about it later. First, Shin needed to tend to the bodies of his fallen comrades, as he couldn't leave them in the cave. Nearly holding back tears, the man began to retrieve the team members who had been killed by the monster one by one. The hero sent the bodies to the headquarters of the Hunter Association, a large building that served as the center for researching and analyzing the first awakenings. Looking out of the headquarters window, a girl expressed doubt that the man should have been left alone so soon. They were talking about Shin, who was slowly returning home after one of the most challenging days of his life. The girl continued to speak, feeling that the case was very strange with many mysterious facts. He insisted that in the chaos that occurred in the dungeon, only a support hunter could have survived. The man himself wouldn't have been able to kill so many high-level comrades. The investigator gently tapped the girl on the head and asked her to calm down. He stated that it was impossible to verify any speculations because the door was already closed, and they needed to rely solely on the facts that emerged during the investigation. Casey asked if the girl had any specific suspicions, noting that cases like this were starting to appear more frequently. The investigator knew that hunters had begun sneaking into the doors because if they were found, the auction would start and weak guilds would not be able to clear the underground towers. He asked the girl to call the boys in for further questioning to clarify the situation. The investigator himself left the building, tying the tie hanging from his pocket. His workday was over and he continued walking down the street. Seeing the cover of a folder with a case involving a strange man, he remembered the man's name from a previous case. It seemed to him that this case was quite unusual, different from the ones he had investigated a few weeks ago. The investigator recalled that Shin remained very calm during the interrogation, which was unusual for people in such situations. Theoretically, the man should have been panicking, but he continued on. The gate leading to the anonymous category meant that someone was pretending to be a representative of the association, or that the Hunter Association itself was involved in suspicious activities. However, the most important concern for the hero was that such situations could occur not only in his guild. All the news summaries were filled with reports of missing people who woke up in other unknown gates, usually young and strong hunters like Moon Doyun. Shin's team realized a horrifying idea, and Shin's legs began to tremble. It seemed that someone had decided to eliminate the heroes from the face of the earth. The hero decided that it would be better to carefully hide his new abilities. Shin was already the sole survivor of an incident at the gate, and if he drew more attention, he would surely be eliminated. The hero shuddered at this thought, and now it seemed he would always be followed. Shin activated the interface and began planning his future. There were a few years left before players would appear, and Shin decided to spend them developing his current skills. He wanted to find at least one skill that would help him become stronger discreetly. Finally, he found a skill that met all his criteria and activated it with a smile. In the swampy forest, flashes of shining swords and powerful spells were visible, and the sound of a fierce struggle could be heard. A swordsman attacked a large human hyena hiding behind a heavy, sturdy wooden shield. The awakened sword broke from the forceful blow. A look of confusion appeared on the hero's face. With a powerful swing of the shield, the hyena sent the man flying, fortunate that the blow was not fatal. The air was knocked out of the hero's lungs, and a mixture of shock, fear, and anger was evident on his face. The man stabbed his sword into the ground to dampen the inertia of the blow and avoid being thrown to the other side of the forest. He jumped to his feet and looked up as if seeing a bird flying in the sky, but the giant hyena was leaping with a great bound towards its confused prey. The hero lost his composure for a moment, captivated by the monster's strength and agility. At the last second before the blow, the man managed to dodge the descending weapon of the monster. The hero's team had lost morale, and it was clear they had lost hope of defeating the monster on their own. The hyena began to close the distance, holding a large club in its right hand, which must have weighed at least 100 grams. This was the Gnoll Lord, who not only had increased resistance to physical attacks but also thick skin that repelled spells. The swordsman could not understand how a monster of this level could appear in a gate with such a low ranking. The Gnoll Lord started attacking again, and a terrifying roar erupted from its mouth, revealing sharp fangs. The team's tank, though trembling with fear, managed to reach the line of attack in time, protecting his friend from certain death with a large shield. Heavy hands trembled under the monster's pressure, and the weight and strength difference between the opponents was enormous. The tank shouted to the swordsman that he could not hold the overlord's pressure for long, and soon the rest of the team would be at risk of being killed. He urged the remaining team members to get up and try to deal at least minimal damage to the enemy. The swordsman continued to panic with thoughts in his head and realized that the Gnoll Lord was called the God of Death for low-level hunters for a reason. The man turned to the remaining team and thought that the desert would not help them in this fight. Even the battle mage was trembling with fear, gripping his wooden staff tightly. The swordsman realized that he had made a mistake in choosing the team, relying too heavily on magical damage. Only one melee fighter remained in the group, as the man's sword had broken during the previous attack, and he was not skilled in hand-to-hand combat. He saw how the tank was struggling, miraculously holding back the Gnoll Lord, and realized that the group had nothing left to fight with. The swordsman regretted not assembling a larger team and had hoped the dungeon would be simple. Moreover, if he won, he would have to split the loot among all the participants, which meant he would receive less reward. Suddenly, the swordsman heard a sound behind him and turned to check the source of the noise. He remembered that there was also an assistant on the team who usually did not participate in battles and only collected resources for the team. The swordsman could not understand how the man could calmly extract resources knowing that everyone would soon be killed by an unbeatable monster. The swordsman's attention was drawn to a tool that Shin was working on. The axe in the man's hand started to disappear as if slowly being erased from reality. It was a skill in weapon crafting often used by hunters and support. A plan began to form in the swordsman's mind, giving hope for escaping the dungeon alive. He decided to carry out the idea and called the assistant, who was extracting resources. Shin turned toward the voice, surrounded by a blue light that seemed to emanate from the man's body rather than from the background. The swordsman quickened his pace and frantically devised a rescue plan on the spot. Finally, the fighter reached Shin and asked if he could make a sword. Shin reluctantly admitted that this skill was part of his repertoire. The warrior asked for a powerful sword that would allow him to fight the Gnoll Lord. At first, Shin refused because he had voluntarily entered the dungeon as an assistant, not as a hero's support. The warrior lost patience and raised his voice, practically shouting that the entire team would soon die if Shin didn't help them. Meanwhile, the Gnoll Lord continued to pound on the tank's shield with powerful blows, putting the knight at risk of being killed in a matter of minutes or even seconds. Shin sighed in frustration, wishing he could gather resources quietly and develop his skills without being noticed. Ultimately, however, he agreed to forge a weapon for the team, albeit with conditions. He asked the entire team to forget about his weapon-making skills when they left the dungeon and expected to be rewarded as a hero's support rather than a mere assistant. The warrior was surprised by such boldness from someone who was not supposed to be a creator and worked as an assistant. Furthermore, all he asked was to provide the team with weapons. Shin smiled, not considering his service useless. He said that equipment was nearly half the key to successfully clearing a dungeon. Moreover, he was willing to vouch for the quality of his products even though his skills were not fully developed. The warrior, taken aback, listened to Shin, disbelief frozen on his face. After activating his skills, Shin extended his hand and offered the warrior assistance under simple terms. The large high-tech guild building named Overkill Guild gleamed under the midday sun. A girl hurried down the hallway, the sound of her heels echoing against the walls. She stopped in front of the large doors leading to the main office of the building. A young man, Craig, answered the knock and invited the visitor in. Lucy entered the large office of the guild leader and informed him that the Hunter Association had sent a request for cooperation. The guild leader explained whether the request was related to an error in the rating of the constructed tower. Craig knew that the association had no other choice and was ready to pay any allocated amount. After all, only one person could awaken and forcibly enter the sealed gate. Craig himself recognized the face of one of the team members featured in today's news report. He was certain he had seen the boy before and tried to recall when and where. Finally, Craig remembered details about the meeting place with the mysterious assistant recently. The guild leader had recently visited the area in front of a gate mistakenly rated very low, and Craig noted that survivors rarely returned from such gates. These cases could be counted on one hand. But this assistant was a member of the team that had survived the dungeon. Monitoring further developments, the leader inquired whether the girl had managed to acquire the requested equipment. Lucy revealed that she had not found a qualified weaponsmith but had managed to obtain a sword with a lower rating. The guild leader stated that he did not want to waste time with low-level weapons, as his skill destroyed blades one after another. Awakening in his chair, Craig swore that at this rate, he would exhaust his entire fortune on disposable equipment. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the guild office door, and the girl stopped mid-sentence. The door was opened by a young man bearing alarming news, which he was instructed to deliver personally to the guild leader. Craig rose from his desk and walked toward the man, not expecting to hear anything positive. The assistant revealed that the dungeon had reopened with an incorrect rating, and this time, newcomers from the Overkill Guild were trapped inside. Craig responded that the situation was urgent and that inexperienced hunters should not be left to face their fate. He declared that he would go personally to rescue the team from the sealed gate. The sky over the city appeared surprisingly clear, with only a gentle breeze rustling the leaves in the trees and only the otherworldly sigh from the large gate disrupting the tranquil scene. A crowd of onlookers, suddenly gathered, recorded the gate with their smartphones. Attention turned to the three people who arrived on the scene. The flash of cameras followed Craig as he approached a young girl observing the situation around the gate and asked for a situation report. She replied that 9 people were trapped inside, one of whom was an ordinary assistant, and most likely all were already dead. Craig asked when the team entered the dungeon. The girl replied that about 2 hours had passed. The guild leader said he hoped to find survivors from the dungeon and would do his best to save them. Craig and Lucy stood in front of the large gate, its color reminiscent of fresh blood spilled on a battlefield. The guild leader tossed a heavy leather bag in front of the gate, something that would be needed by the man later. Meanwhile, he extended his right hand, signaling to Lucy to take action. The girl reached into the small bag hanging on her shoulder, and a bright beam of light erupted from it. Lucy pulled out a long katana, which could only be stored in her bag using subspace abilities, and handed the sword to Craig. The guild leader gripped the hilt tightly in his right hand, bringing the sword to his face and activating his unique skill. The katana blade burst into bright flames. Craig made a light swing with his right hand, slicing through the space in front of him, and a narrow fissure appeared on the surface of the gate. After using the separation ability, the crack in the gate gradually widened, and air began to whistle through. The katana used by the guild leader became covered in cracks, and the tip of the blade started to crumble into small pieces. He handed the now useless weapon to his assistant, who asked Craig to be as careful as possible. The guild leader picked up the bag that had been thrown on the ground and stepped through the gate. Craig reached the other side and immediately began assessing the situation in the dungeon. After a few steps, the guild leader stopped in front of the gate. A large room opened up before him, filled with the barely visible corpses of enemies lying in pools of green blood. Craig continued to study the room and noticed that the temperature and humidity were rising. This indicated that the guild leader was dealing with intelligent reptiles, as evidenced by the green blood stains on the ground. The man concluded that the dungeon was inhabited by human-like lizards, whose intelligence and combat prowess increased with age. These reptilian underlings seemed quite old, so their leader must be very experienced. Craig crossed the room, which had become a mass grave for the lizard men, in 2 leaps, and the guild leader rushed to assist the team as quickly as possible. He didn't want to lose any newcomers. Finally, he entered the hall where the trapped group was located. Craig stopped and his gaze froze at the scene unfolding in the room. A large lizard, comparable in size to an average adult, was preparing to attack with its sword. However, to Craig's surprise, a swordsman from the missing team managed to block the attack, crossing blades with the creature. An archer girl supported the fighter by shooting arrows at the enemy. Pierced by the projectiles, one of the lizards fell, bleeding from its side. Craig was astonished to realize that the group not only needed rescue but had also succeeded in defeating a superior enemy force. Monsters are more experienced than newcomers entering the gate. Craig was distracted from his thoughts by the unusual clash of swords and turned his gaze to the center of the room. A lizard knocked a sword out of a warrior's hand, sending the weapon flying. The man seemed nearly defeated. The conscious man himself stared at the massive shadow of the creature looming over him in fear. The reptile raised its arm, intending to finish the warrior with a powerful blow. Craig reacted immediately, and time seemed to slow around him. However, the lizard had already delivered the devastating blow. Instantly, sparks from the creature's sword blinded everyone. However, the monster's weapon encountered an unexpected obstacle. The lizard growled in frustration as its massive energy sword failed to cut the person in front of it in two. The warrior, unaware of his luck, knelt down while Craig advanced to confront the enemy. For a moment, Craig paused to survey the room, trying to understand who could have used such a complex spell to save the warrior. He saw Shin creating a shadow sword using mana. Shin sensed the scrutinizing gaze and tried to discern its source. He turned slowly, searching for the origin of the unusual sensation, and met Craig Overkill's eyes, which were studying the boy intently. The battle continued, and with the help of healing spells, the warrior's health quickly recovered. Battle mages created fireballs, while tanks held off the attacks of the large red lizard. Behind them, Shin counted the participants in the dungeon mission. He counted each warrior one by one, including himself, but stopped at the ninth. He stared at Craig standing near the guild leader. There were 10 people in the dungeon, even though Shin was sure only 9 had entered. Craig asked the man what he was doing in the midst of such a fierce battle. Without much talk, the assassin charged at the enemy in an attempt to destroy the lizard, but the creature managed to deflect the attack. The assassin's sword shattered into pieces. The assassin fell on his back, exposed to the next attack. The support mage turned to help his friend. The monster raised its giant weapon above its head. In a moment, 2 team members would lose their lives. Craig noticed the newcomer's dire situation and immediately reacted to the danger. Craig launched a swift attack at the enemy, pushing off the stone floor and raising his katana, ready to deliver a crushing blow to the enemy. Shin thought he hadn't expected Craig's help and directed his attention to the bag next to him. Craig used one sword, while the other was in excellent condition, and Shin thought it was a spare weapon. Shin continued to watch the battle calmly. In the middle of the room, the thin katana clashed with the lizard's massive sword, and sparks flew in all directions. The force of the blow was so great that a strong energy wave almost swept the rest of the team away. Craig ordered the newcomers to retreat before they became incidental victims of this intense battle. The assassin was exhausted and couldn't say a word, thanking the support mage Craig for his rescue. Craig knocked the massive sword out of the lizard's hand with a skillful move, and the weapon fell to the stone floor. Fire ignited the man's katana again, and he decided to use his skills before the enemy recovered. Craig advanced, a few quick sword swings backed by skill, leaving the lizard standing behind him with large open wounds all over the monster's body. Green blood began to flow, and finally, the monster fell to the cold ground, unable to comprehend where its defeat had come from. Due to the effect of the skill and the clash with the enemy's massive sword, Craig's katana began to crumble in his hands. Craig noticed quick movement in front of him. Another lizard ran towards him, seemingly wanting to face a stronger opponent and leaving the newcomers to be devoured. This time, Craig decided to retreat. He jumped to the side to avoid the monster's strike. The lizard missed, and Craig barely managed to keep his balance after the quick move. Shin shouted to Craig, wanting to know how powerful the weapon was. The katana was almost entirely destroyed in the guild leader's hands, rendering it unsuitable for battle. Shin noted that such a weapon might come at a high cost. Craig initially wanted to trap the newcomers but was interrupted when he saw the weapon crafting skill. Shin paused for a moment as he crafted a new weapon for the experienced Craig. The man offered Craig to use the extraordinary katana crafted with mana. Shin requested not to waste another ordinary sword, especially since there was only one spare sword. Craig couldn't believe his eyes. A high-quality katana had been crafted by Shin in just a few swings. Craig wondered why an experienced assistant like that was working as a helper. Shin took the old sword from Craig's hand and stated his condition in exchange for the great weapon. He asked Craig to forget Shin's skills and himself after leaving the dungeon. However, Craig didn't think he could forget everything just because the assistant wanted him to. At the same moment, the katana forged by Shin began to melt in Craig's hands. Shin remarked that in this situation, the man had to cut down everyone with a high-end, expensive weapon. Realizing his desperate situation, Craig reluctantly agreed to forget about the man's skills. The team continued to battle the giant lizard while Craig and Shin negotiated the terms of their agreement. Finally, Shin smiled with satisfaction and invited Craig to try out the new weapon. Craig selected a new target, eager to see what this sensitive sword could do. Fortunately, there were still plenty of enemies in the room, and one of the lizards quickly moved towards the moving target. Craig swung the katana, unleashing its destructive power once again, and his eyes turned red. He crossed swords with the monster, and the room was once again filled with flashes of fire that illuminated everything around. The lizard screamed in pain and anger as its large sword began to shatter. Finally, half of the giant weapon was destroyed, much to Craig's surprise. He had only intended to parry the attack, but the result exceeded his expectations. He gripped the katana's hilt more tightly and thought that this weapon was not only better controlled but also naturally stronger than any sword he had bought. Craig glanced at Shin, who returned to his task of assisting and continued to extract mana stones. The lizard with the broken sword attacked Craig furiously, intending to finish off the arrogant man. Although Craig was distracted by his thoughts, he was quick enough to react to the counterattack. Craig plunged the katana deep into the belly of the large creature, thinking that the weapon deserved to be tested with skill. A large stream of fire tore through the lizard's body from within, piercing the monster. Craig grasped his opponent's shoulder to pull the sword from the monster's belly. He jumped on top of the lizard and chose a more advantageous position for the final blow. He raised the katana above his head, empowering the weapon with his skill, and plunged the red-hot sword into the lizard's head, destroying the monster's brain and neck. Green blood spurted from the defeated lizard's mouth, leaving a large, lifeless carcass on the ground. The enemy fell to the ground, and Craig stood over it like a hunter over his prey. Craig inspected the katana and was surprised to find not a single scratch after 2 uses of the skill. Craig was soon surrounded by novice team members who awkwardly thanked him for saving them from certain death. The man noted that no one was hurt, and that could be considered a success. With the loot and agreeing to accompany the guild leader in the final battle, the man explained that he would pursue Craig and not participate in the fight. The main prison room was filled with smoke from the torches burning on the walls, illuminating the cages hanging from the ceiling, clearly used for torturing the victims. As he entered the room, Craig froze in place, staring ahead and analyzing the strength of the opponent he saw. In the middle of the room, the prison chief sat on a throne, at his feet a giant reptile guard that looked more like a dragon than a lizard. Shin saw an interface providing information about the opponent and chose to ignore the disturbing engravings. Craig smiled, anticipating an entertaining fight and eager to try out his new katana. The chief said he would try to end the fight before the katana collapsed, and Shin replied that he was not joking about the quality of the weapon and it would never break. The reptile chief jumped off his throne, his eyes flashing with anger as he knew his kin were finished if these 2 men were in the throne room. He commanded the reptile guards to attack first, and they immediately obeyed. The creature's eyes turned red, allowing agility and speed to attack simultaneously. Both heroes almost responded simultaneously and dodged the deadly blow. Craig's eyes began to glow, and he slid towards the giant monster, but the reptile did not allow itself to be attacked. With a tail strike, it stopped the chief's movement. Thanks to his incredible reaction, he managed to escape Craig's attack. The guild leader flew away from the powerful strike. If not for the collision with the katana, the man would not have survived. After the sudden tail strike, the reptile's attack was so strong that Craig flew to the 2nd floor and planted his feet on the ground above the main room. Using this position as a way to push off and gain speed, a new round began as he flew towards the main guard like a loaded cannon. The lizard chief jumped from the other end of the room and pushed the throne with his claws. In the middle of the room, the opponents exchanged blades and glared at each other, even a smile visible on the reptile's snout. Finally, the opponents leaped to opposite ends of the room. The lizard chief decided to use his aid and jumped onto the back of his follower's dragon, controlling the situation. A large stream of fire erupted from the dragon's mouth. To be under such a stream meant certain death. Craig used his sword to prevent damage from the firestorm, but suddenly he saw a power shield in front of him seconds before the collision. The fire hit the magical shield that appeared out of nowhere. The hero used his enhanced crafting skill to protect the guild leader from damage. The tamed dragon tried to attack in close combat, using Craig's confusion, but the chief avoided the bite. He jumped back to Shin and asked how the man made the shield since he specialized in weapon crafting. Shin replied that a shield was also a type of weapon because it could cause damage. Craig smiled. The guild leader froze, waiting for the opponent's turn. He focused all his attention on the prison chief. The lizard smiled, raising its hand to use its trump card. A sharp blade connected to a long chain shot towards the guild leader at high speed, wrapping the chain around the katana, blazing with bright flames. Craig barely had enough time to notice the movement. The lizard pulled the chain tightly, holding the sword, and began to reel it in. The leader tried to disarm the enemy, realizing that with the katana in his hand, the guild leader was very dangerous. Without letting go of his sword, Craig flew along the chain towards the reptile, thinking hard about how to get out of this difficult situation. Shin urged the guild leader to stop playing around and continue the fight. The man raised his hand and used his power. A new sword began to form in Craig's left hand. Shin was very successful in speeding up the weapon-making process. Finally, a black katana appeared in the guild leader's hand, and he could continue the battle. Craig released the first blade, and the empty chain remained in the leader's hand. With the new weapon, the guild leader began to slaughter the makeshift dragon, giving it no chance to survive. The lizard leader did not expect such a trick and watched his dying comrade in confusion. After finishing off the dragon, Craig threw his katana at the monster with a powerful throw. The blade slid across the leader's shoulder, narrowly avoiding the deadly projectile. Taking advantage of the moment, the guild leader closed the distance and found himself close to the reptile. Craig delivered a powerful kick to the leader's torso, throwing him back several meters. The creature had no time to orient itself, and as it fell, a heavy blow hit its back. The monster began to lose its edge on the battlefield. Taking advantage of the reptile's confusion, the guild leader jumped into the air, forming another katana in his hand. Craig activated an ability that enhanced the sword's power, the blade coated with flames. The leader realized his life was about to end, able only to gaze at the dangerous enemy in admiration. The guild leader finally struck. A whirlwind of fire lit up the room, but the blade hit the ground hard. With inhuman reflexes, the lizard still managed to avoid the deadly blow, losing its left arm, the flesh burned by the intense heat. Not wanting to give up completely, the leader decided to try to kill at least one of the guild leader's followers. The monster grabbed a spear and started running towards the main character. The spear tip flew towards Sean's throat, but suddenly hit an insurmountable barrier. The lizard did not understand how the man was still standing. Shin was angry at the reptile's audacity, making the leader look utterly pathetic in front of the man. The guild leader approached the monster from behind, his gaze full of hatred and determination to end the duel. The last thing the old lizard saw in life with its remaining right eye was the katana blazing with bright flames. The spectators and journalists were still recording the gate where a group of newcomers had fallen. Finally, the color of the gate changed to blue, and the crowd cheered with joy. A group of people emerged from the gate. The team of newcomers led by Craig finally returned home. Journalists immediately surrounded the guild leader and began bombarding him with questions while the guards held back the press. Lucy ran to the guild leader, worried about his head, and asked if he needed medical help, but Craig replied that she should take care of the newly arrived team because they might be seriously injured. Shin returned the backpack full of mana gems to the group leader and told him he had received the advance payment and would go home to rest. Shin took one last look at the crowd gathered at the gate, turned around, and began his journey home, hoping to spend the night in peace. One of the journalists managed to approach the guild leader, bringing the microphone closer, and asked for a comment on how difficult it was to save the newcomers. Craig answered honestly that he couldn't do it alone, then turned to look for the mysterious assistant, but the man was already gone. The guild leader tried to find him in the crowd while the members of the newcomer team checked their damaged weapons and thanked Craig for his miraculous rescue. The guild leader patted one of the knights on the shoulder and shouted that they should thank the assistant who made weapons for everyone. However, the knight did not understand what he meant, saying there was no weapon maker in prison. The other team members confirmed the knight's words. They knew there was an assistant in prison, but he couldn't make weapons. The assassin and sorcerer previously saved by the guild leader remained silent. They were sure they had seen an axe in Shin's hands, but they saw that the man was still collecting mana stones and seemed to have simply lost the tool during the flight operation. Craig didn't understand how the team could fail to remember that one of the assistants had made weapons for them. Finally, the guild leader realized that Shin used a magical calculation skill that erased the memories of those who agreed to the man's terms. Craig's assistant did not understand why the leader fell silent and could not utter a word. Suddenly, the guild leader tossed a large bag of weapons into his assistant's hands and started sprinting towards the park without reacting to the crowd's sudden amazement. The assistants could only guess the reason for the guild leader's strange behavior. Meanwhile, Craig ran without looking back, hoping to catch up with his valuable ally. The leader ran to the park and began searching for Shin throughout the area, but there was no sign of him on the park benches or in the central square. Craig realized that he had lost Shin and looked around the square once more. Finally, he turned and began his journey back to the gate he had just passed. Craig's assistant followed their leader and asked for an explanation of what had happened. The guild leader ordered his assistant to urgently search for one person, and Shin was entirely convinced that every participant in the flight operation to the dungeon had forgotten him. He continued his journey calmly towards home. Back at the guild headquarters, Lucy immediately started looking for information about Shin. She managed to find out that Shin had gone underground again a few hours ago. Craig thanked the girl for her quick and efficient work. Lucy asked the guild leader to explain why he was so interested in a low-ranking assistant, but Craig was certain that the assistant's unassuming appearance was deceiving. The guild leader leaned back in his chair and pondered about the mysterious assistant from the dungeon. He thought that if the assistant didn't use his calculation skills at such a high level, no one would uncover the extraordinary abilities of the young man. Craig had firmly decided to recruit Shin into his guild. The leader looked at his hands and recalled the incredible sensation of immense power emanating from the sword crafted by Shin. He had never experienced anything like it before. Not only was the fabric crafted with skill, but it also allowed Craig to fully unleash his destructive abilities. The guild leader had seen many weapon makers and tried hundreds of swords. He had traveled to various countries to meet blacksmiths considered the best in their field. Craig had always been very particular about selecting weapons and had high standards. Each blacksmith was confident in the quality of their products and usually asserted that their products would withstand any inspection. Craig carefully tested every sample he received. He even brought along weak monsters to test under combat conditions that were close to reality. But every time, the guild leader was disappointed with the weapons offered. With clear dissatisfaction, he returned the test samples to the blacksmiths. After all, every sword offered for testing failed and broke after using the guild leader's skills. Every blacksmith was shocked by the failure, tearing their hair, and Craig left empty-handed, hoping to finally find at least one suitable sword elsewhere. Rumor had it that one blacksmith quit his profession because he couldn't bear the shame. But the weapons made by Shin were different from all the others. The guild leader wouldn't have believed it if he hadn't seen with his own eyes how the man created a sword like no other with extraordinary properties. Craig took a deep breath and asked Lucy what was on his schedule for the day. The girl reminded him of a meeting with another guild leader, but the man asked to postpone the event because he would leave early for the wild forest far from the city. A new gateway to the dungeon opened this time, waiting for bloodthirsty goblins for the heroes beyond the gate. A knight quickly attacked one of the monsters with a few swings. The tank was very surprised by the quality of the weapon made by the assistant. The sword made by the unassuming boy easily surpassed even the dungeon leader's weapons. Shin himself, as usual, was collecting mana crystals far from the raging battle. The knight couldn't stop admiring the protagonist's skillful work. The tank said he had never seen a sword of such high quality before and examined the weapon from all sides. He sincerely thanked the assistant for his sword, which greatly helped the team. The knight offered to recruit the valuable boy into his guild, and the wizard supported the idea. They felt that the man deserved more than just being a low-paid assistant for every dungeon. Shin heard this conversation and was distracted from his work. He thought he had spent more mana than he had planned because the group could barely handle the low-level dungeon. Shin recalled his first journey where he became a gambler in an instant. In the battle with the golem, the hero felt a vast mana reserve and couldn't imagine this could happen, but everything was spent on destroying the monster and hadn't recovered since then. Therefore, for the time being, Shin now only had a small mana reserve corresponding to his level. The hero was glad because he gained new experience for the future, and now there were no issues in making weapons. After all, the quality of the items made was determined by the amount of mana spent. There was another way to improve the quality of the weapons made, which was to study the principles of making them in the real world. The hero remembered how much he trained after learning that one could reach new heights by studying weapons. His training was not in vain, and Shin received results tenfold. After all, he used mana more efficiently, otherwise his reserves would not be enough to make high-quality weapons. However, the hero decided that he needed to work to increase the amount of mana because calculation skills also consumed a considerable amount. Although there was equipment in the world that could increase the supply of magical energy, it was very expensive and not available to the hero. Shin could only afford to buy mana potions, which at least had some effect on his situation. The hero checked his account balance and saw that with his salary as an assistant, it would be difficult for him to buy the potions. Shin also checked the mana recharge bar for the task and was dissatisfied with the low efficiency, only 1% per dungeon. Thanks to the dungeons with error levels, the hero received more mana from high-level opponents, but it was impossible to understand the dungeon level until entering it. For instance, the last operation was more difficult without Craig's help. Shin decided that he needed to find a dungeon with a suitable boss to earn rewards as soon as possible. Finally, the team exited the gate, and the captain thanked everyone for their good work. The hero stayed at the exit for a while to check if everything went according to plan. The calculations began, and the entire group forgot about the assistant's magical ability to create weapons. Suddenly, Shin was called by his name from behind. The man thought his calculations could still be wrong. He turned nervously, trying to find a solution to the problem, but the guild leader and his assistant quickly approached the hero. Craig greeted Shin, and the man realized that calculations did not help erase the memories of experienced people who had awakened. Shin tried to joke that he was seeing a man for the first time, but Craig asked the man not to run away and listen because his offer was really worthwhile. The guild leader held a black and red business card with the organization's emblem. Shin took the business card in his hand and examined it carefully, looking at the small plastic piece with only a name. The guild and its emblem were very proud, but this was enough for the hero to understand that they were talking about one of the best guilds in the country. Shin realized that it was too early to join such a large organization and wanted to decline politely, but the man could only evade crudely and said he didn't have time and needed to leave immediately. Craig held the hero's shoulder firmly and said the man would not regret the conversation. Furthermore, the conversation would not take much time, and he promised to treat him to dinner. Shin noticed that such a famous guild leader had a lot of free time to spend on a low-level recruit. Finally, Shin agreed to talk and asked him not to hold him without a clear reason. Craig just smiled contentedly, expecting much from the dinner, and promised not to waste Shin's precious time. The car stopped at a traditional Asian-style restaurant. Craig and Lucy sat across from Shin at a table with expensive, delicious dishes. Shin began the conversation and asked the guild leader to get straight to the point and explain that he didn't understand why one of the best guilds in the country needed an ordinary assistant. Craig began to explain the reason for inviting the hero to the conversation. The guild leader was very angry and needed weapons that could withstand a great burden in battle. This chapter tells of his journey around the world searching for the perfect sword. He even asked the most skilled magical weapon makers, but the blades always remained the same regardless of the product's quality or magic level. All blades could not withstand the guild leader's power and broke in his hands. Craig said he met the only exception after a long search. He recalled his meeting with Shin in the dungeon and said the only sword that survived was the blade made by Shin. Shin listened to the story quietly and reminded himself to be careful when using his recovery ability, as in this case, it did not work at all. The hero leaned on the table, waiting for Craig's story to end. The guild leader drank tea and finally decided to tell Shin the reason he called him. The man invited the hero to join the Overkill organization. Lucy couldn't believe her ears because her leader offered a huge salary to a few assistants. Craig explained the terms, an excellent salary, covering all expenses, and a 1-year contract. However, Shin didn't listen to the guild leader and interrupted him in mid-sentence. Shin got up from the table and said he would not join any guild at this time, thanked him for the delicious dinner, and said it was time for him to leave. Craig tried to stop the hero, but he had already left the room and did not listen to the story. Lucy was surprised by such a generous offer from her leader and wondered what made him propose such terms. Craig explained that the girl didn't realize how good the boy's weapons were. The guild leader said he hadn't felt a sense of unity with a blade in a long time. With such a weapon, he felt capable of anything. However, he pointed out that the purpose of the offer was also financial gain. Lucy realized that the guild leader spent a lot of money on weapons that always broke, but Craig had no choice because he needed a sword to use his abilities. The girl admitted that, with those profits, the contract amount seemed small. She kept wondering where else she could find such a weapon maker and concluded that so far, she only knew one suitable candidate. That is why she would not stop trying to recruit Shin into the guild by any means, no matter what the hero wanted in return. The hero returned home and thought that he didn't expect an offer from one of the best guilds so soon. He thought that with that salary, he could buy better equipment, but he decided to be patient and wait. The Great Hall, like a medieval arena, was covered in bloodstains and mist. Around were defeated goblins, low-level monsters, but the main danger in the dungeon did not come from the little green-skinned creatures. The knight saw the man standing in front of him and demanded an explanation. The mysterious opponent held his large sword and the sword lying on the ground. A wicked smile appeared on his face, and he said that people usually begged not to be killed instead of asking stupid questions. The knight thought he was just an ordinary thief stealing from low-level groups, but Jack replied that he didn't want to spend extra energy explaining his motives, but he was ready to share information if the knight could win the duel. The knight thought he had no chance and analyzed his opponent's weaknesses. The knight shouted and ran towards Jack, trying to get close and attack. The two warriors raised their swords and struck each other. Their blades clashed and sparked, and Jack just smiled at his opponent. The knight struggled to defeat his opponent and thought of his next move. Finally, the tank kept attacking and decided to deliver as many blows as possible. Jack countered every attack effortlessly and seemed bored. Finally, the villain snatched the sword from the knight's hands, and the blade flew high. Taking advantage of the man's confusion, Jack kicked his stomach hard, causing the poor man to fly to the other end of the hall. The knight clutched his stomach, feeling fortunate to have survived the attack and escaped with only a few broken bones. But Jack was ready to correct this oversight. He walked toward the tank, dragging his heavy sword along the ground. The man's nerves began to fray, and he started pleading for mercy from the villain, tears streaming down his cheeks and his body trembling with fear and pain. A smile spread across the cruel killer's face as he raised his massive sword above the knight. Despite the weapon's weight, Jack ended his opponent with a small movement, beheading him. Finally, there wasn't a single living creature left in the hall except for Jack himself, along with the goblins and people lying on the ground, mostly shattered into pieces. The villain felt disappointed by this quick ending and wished he could find an evenly matched opponent for the first time in a long while. Jack was drawn to the expression on the enemy's severed head and began talking to the corpse. Then, he pulled a phone from his robe pocket and promised to tell everyone that the knight had bravely slain the leader. Jack started taking photos of the enemy's remains, saying that such losses were common in dungeons with the wrong ranking. The villain looked at the photos with an obsessive smile. Some pictures turned out well. He liked collecting items, and maybe photos with defeated enemies were his favorite items in that collection. While browsing through the gallery, the villain was distracted by an unexpected feeling that shook his whole body. He sensed a sly energy and demanded its wielder hide their aura or come out and stop hiding. A tall and slender girl entered the dungeon, easily opening the heavy gate. Her body was surrounded by a strange light. Jack said that he wasn't wrong when he asked the head not to rush into this dungeon because there was nothing useful here. Karen turned and asked the villain how he dared to contradict her. Jack quickly changed the topic and asked the girl to clear the dungeon, and the witch began using her magical powers. At the end of their conversation, the villain reminded Karen of her promise to give him a high-ranking hero to smash into tiny pieces as part of continuing the demonic ritual. The girl said she would keep her promise and would soon bring Jack. A bright light started emanating from the wounds on the defeated knight's body. After a moment, claws clearly belonging to a monster emerged from there. Karen saw the monster in front of her and smiled happily. The girl's cheeks flushed as if she saw something cute. She was thrilled with the summoning. This time, she had managed to get an incredible demon, and the result exceeded her expectations. Reaching high levels in the dungeon wasn't easy, but if Shin joined the Overkill Guild, he could access gates of any level. Shin realized that in their world, the name and reputation of the guild a hunter joined could work wonders. Every organization had its fans and envious people who worshipped or hated the guild members. Salaries and the number of rewards for completing dungeons also depended on the guild's level. Members of large, popular organizations not only received extensive responsibilities but also certain rights. For example, they might get permission to enter rare gates inaccessible to ordinary awakened people. Of course, the rewards in such dungeons differed markedly from others and opened new opportunities not only financially. Craig said that anyone who awakened should strive to reach their goal, and by joining the Overkill Guild, Shin would achieve incredible heights. However, Shin firmly refused to join Craig's guild. Like everyone else, the guild leader was surprised by Shin's words, because anyone who awakened would do anything to join such a famous and powerful company. Craig quietly observed Shin, trying to understand the reason behind his refusal to join anywhere. The guild leader suggested that the man might have a strong reason to refuse, one of which might be the recent loss of allies in a gate due to an error. The group continued to move deeper into the cave, and the witch girl Anita lit the way with her staff. Andrew, a young swordsman, suddenly got caught in a thick web hanging above him. The witch raised her staff, and the group saw the ceiling of the cave full of spider webs. The group leader, John, instructed everyone to stay alert as they were entering monster territory. Intelligence reported that the dungeon was inhabited by about 100 legion spiders, which were only a threat in large numbers, but not individually. The captain added that the spiders' fangs contained a paralyzing toxin. While preparing weapons, the guild leader asked Shin to stay away from the attacking enemies, but Shin asked them not to worry about him and calmly prepared for battle. Craig disagreed, thinking that all team members should protect the supporting hunter. The conversation was cut short by a sharp sound echoing through the cave, and the whole team stared into the darkness, trying to see their opponent. Hundreds of sharp claws covered in steel appendages tapped the floor and ceiling of the cave, moving toward the heroes. These were legion spiders that not only wanted to protect their nest but also craved fresh human flesh. Seeing the dozens of monsters, Andrew began to tremble and tried to calm himself. The spiders relentlessly approached their prey. Up close, the monsters looked massive. Finally, the swarm attacked the team, and venom flowed from their jaws in all directions, quickly surrounding the heroes. Andrew split the first enemy in half, and the foolish spiders leapt onto the shield covering the hero. In seconds, the warrior sent another giant insect flying, green blood splattering against the cave walls. The monsters seemed unaware of the barrier formed by the tank's shield, reinforced with magical skills, and continued to attack the team. The tank used a deadly strike ability, sending the corpses of spiders flying to the other end of the cave. Anita wasted no time, raising her staff above her head and preparing to cast a spell. Bolts of lightning flew from her staff toward the enemy. The spiders had no defense against magic, and their weak defenses and low health left them no chance of survival. Craig had not yet joined the fight and felt relieved to see that his team was managing against the enemy, despite the hunters' relatively low levels. The guild leader was surprised to see Shin observing something in the depths of the cave. It was a new batch of monsters quickly moving toward the team, clearly intent on destroying the arrogant humans. The spiders surrounded the group from behind, attempting to strike the exposed flank, where there were only two heroes. Craig readied his weapon, the blade of his sword engulfed in flames. The guild leader wielded the fire like a sword, slicing through the bodies of the insects. One strike from Craig destroyed dozens of spiders, and their charred corpses fell to the cave floor. Craig continued his assault, pleased that the enemies were so weak. After all that, Craig didn't even need to use his sword in battle, he only needed the energy from his skills to fight the enemy. The guild leader heard a cry for help and paused his next attack to understand what was happening. Insects surrounded the remaining group, who were not accustomed to dealing with so many monsters at once. The tank cursed the scout, who had warned of far fewer monsters in the dungeon. The warrior and the wizard fought with all their remaining strength, and the wizard was nearly out of mana from the previous attacks. Craig realized that the hunters wouldn't last long at this rate, and needed to help their allies. The guild leader asked Shin to follow him so he wouldn't fall into the hands of the monsters, but Shin asked Craig not to worry and to help the others while he dealt with the rest himself. A spider leapt and was about to attack Shin from above. Craig thought Shin would be finished soon because he wouldn't be able to dodge the monster's sharp jaws, but Shin froze in place and closed his eyes as if he had lost the last instinct for survival. Finally, Shin opened his eyes, filled with a bright blue light, a clear sign of using mana. A spider suddenly floated in the air, unable to understand what was stopping it from reaching its goal. An energy blade was thrust into the monster's back, slicing through its insect body and leaving a large wound. Craig couldn't believe what was happening because just a second ago, Shin was on the verge of death. The spider's body fell at Shin's feet, nearly crushed with green blood. The hero of the story believed the most effective tactic was to create several swords and quickly handle the swarm of monsters. However, his mana didn't allow him to maintain multiple blades simultaneously, so he would control only one. A long energy ball appeared from the hero's finger, following Shin's will. In the end, a one-handed sword also formed from mana. The hero stood calmly in the middle of the cave, controlling his weapon with just the movements of his hand. The blade approached the spiders, attacking the hero very quickly, easily piercing the created insects and leaving large holes in their bodies. The melodious sound struck the monsters faster and faster as Shin used his weapon. The hero of the story felt invincible, standing in the middle of the battlefield unscathed. He thought he could never have dreamed of such power, even after finally waking up. Eventually, the stream of monsters stopped, and the cave walls lit up with the sound of energy spreading in all directions. Craig couldn't utter a word as he watched the display put on by a low-level kid who had never stood out. Shin was very pleased with the result, thanking the system for choosing him as a player and giving him this incredible ability. Shin finished off the last spider hiding among the corpses of its brethren. Craig understood what he had just witnessed and tried to figure out where his assistant had the ability to attack in such an area. Finally, after completing the bloody battle, Shin recalled the sword, and it began to dissolve into the air. Craig reminded him that the other team members were still in mortal danger, and the guild leader needed to move quickly to help their allies. Anyway, the team was fighting with their last bit of strength, and the swarm of insects didn't seem to decrease in number. Craig immediately activated his berserk ability, saying he wanted to ask the hero of the story some questions after clearing the dungeon. Shin asked the guild leader to pretend that he was the one who destroyed the remaining spiders because no one would believe that some assistant could do it. Anyway, continuing towards the rest of the group, Craig agreed to fulfill the hero's request. A few minutes later, the battle finally ended. The giant spider bodies and webs burned on the cave floor after Craig's powerful rampage to save their lives. He said he did not expect to see such a famous guild leader in this low-level dungeon. Craig apologized for trying to hide his identity and explained that he just wanted to explore the gate quietly without attracting much attention. Suddenly, a female mage interrupted the guild leader, asking him to accept their heartfelt thanks for saving the team. The girl blushed with embarrassment, saying that Craig's slaughter of the spiders was incredible and that she would be delighted to take a photo with the famous person as a keepsake. The heroes turned to the sound behind them. It was Shin and Andrew, who had started exploring the cave for useful resources. They successfully gathered all the valuable items and ensured no monsters were around, but they also found a corridor leading deeper into the cave. Andrew offered to explore it, but the team captain disagreed with such an adventure. He believed the hunters only had a little strength left, and the expedition would be dangerous. Additionally, the intelligence had been wrong about the number of spiders in the dungeon, and it was unknown what could be expected in the depths of the cave. Moreover, the gate was separate from the earth, and the dungeon's logic differed greatly from normal reality. Even though the dungeon had been carefully studied up to this day, its principles were still not fully understood. Not every hunter could adapt to the dungeon immediately, and this experience usually ended in death. People began seeking help from scouts, individuals who were awakened and specially trained. These scouts were hunters with camouflage or tracking skills that allowed them to remain undetected. After such explorations, the level of the dungeon could change significantly depending on the data obtained. Scouts became a crucial link in the chain of interaction between the awakened and the gates. John mentioned that while the accuracy of intelligence was high, it never reached 100%, making it very likely that the dungeon the team entered had been misclassified. Andrew humbly suggested continuing the exploration of the gate, as an experienced hunter was fighting alongside the team. However, the captain insisted that it was dangerous to proceed because it was unknown what might be lurking in the depths of the cave, especially since even with the presence of the guild leader, one of the team members could lose their life due to negligence. The swordsman pleaded with the leader, sparking a desire to complete the dungeon for his personal goal. The tank still doubted the feasibility of continuing the expedition. No treasure is worth a life. Anita joined Andrew and also wanted to reach the end of the cave and obtain the valuable reward that might be hidden in the boss room. John's speech was interrupted by the guild leader, and Craig announced that he, too, was ready to continue the journey. He said that he came to fully explore the dungeon and might find something interesting in the boss room. The leader mentioned that the coordinated actions of the group would surely lead them to victory and that there was no need to worry. John bowed and thanked the experienced hunter for his confidence in the team's strength and agreed to continue the expedition. The tank added that he was naturally ready to hand over leadership to Craig if asked, but the guild leader requested that John continue managing the team as he was doing an excellent job. The knight agreed and suggested the team continue exploring the path they had found earlier. The group continued their journey through the dark rooms of the cave, and the female mage glanced back at Craig dreamily. Along the way, the cave turned out to be much larger than it initially appeared, but at least the team did not stumble upon any swarms of terrifying spiders. Finally, the group arrived at a large door that seemed to lead to the boss room. John stopped to give final instructions before the difficult battle with the monster. According to intelligence, the queen spider of the Legion awaited the team ahead. It was a giant spider capable of controlling its subordinates. Despite its large size, the queen was considered a relatively straightforward boss whose main task was to spawn Legion spiders. John placed his hand on the door of the room and added that anything could be expected because the intelligence might be wrong. Finally, the tank began opening the large door of the room. A thin beam of light burst into the room from outside, but so far, the inside remained in pitch darkness and nothing could be seen. The female mage used her staff to illuminate the room and assess the situation. Craig listened intently to his senses and felt nothing unusual. Furthermore, he did not even sense the slightest sign of the boss or any monsters in the room. However, the team found the queen. John ordered the team to get ready and raised his shield. The monster hovered menacingly above the hunters while Legion spiders approached within striking range. The female mage was pleased that this time the intelligence had provided accurate data and that the boss turned out to be the queen. She decided to strike first and began emitting mana energy from her staff. A discharge of electricity burst from the tip of the staff and shot toward the spider. The attack was so powerful that it cleared the boss's minions from the path and turned the small monsters to ash. Anita was thrilled to have destroyed so many opponents with just one spell, but her joy was replaced by shock when she noticed something strange. The queen was already dead. Its body was completely covered in large wounds, and a massive chunk of its body was missing. John couldn't understand how the boss could already be dead if the team had just entered the room. Sensing something was wrong, the tank turned and ordered an immediate retreat from the dungeon. Before he could finish speaking, the entire group felt an overwhelming energy surge in the room. The knight could barely suppress the urge to flee the dungeon in panic, and all his emotions were replaced by fear. A large purple claw descended on the defeated queen's body, striking it. In the corner of the room stood another monster that had managed to hide its presence. This spider-like monster was several times larger than the queen and resembled a cross between a human and a giant spider. It turned out that this monster was Arachne, the ruler of all spiders, possessing high intelligence and the ability to control all types of spider monsters. The team stared at the suddenly appearing boss in terror. Its level far exceeded the group's capabilities. Arachne decided to destroy the hunters with one blow of its massive claw but was thwarted by a barrier. Craig, who had activated his berserk skill, was the one who blocked the attack with his sword, saving the others from certain death. The guild leader did not understand how such a high-level monster could end up in the dungeon. Arachne's shield was strong, and without the ability to use a sword, it was impossible to leave a scratch on it. The monster did not expect such fierce resistance from the hunters, so Craig did not waste time attacking. He needed to inflict as much damage as possible before the sword collapsed, but he failed to deliver a fatal blow. The blade couldn't withstand the pressure and shattered into fragments. The guild leader found himself in an undesirable position, halted in midair and unable to avoid Arachne's attack. Shin came to Craig's aid and activated his crafting skills. Shin blocked the boss's strike with a blade that would serve as a temporary weapon for the guild leader. He asked Craig to buy time while he tried to craft a suitable sword to fight the formidable enemy. As an intelligent monster, Arachne realized she needed to shift her focus to Shin. The hero completed crafting a temporary blade for the guild leader. Having exhausted much of his mana in previous battles, Shin's body had now fully depleted in this state. Shin took a mana potion with him, which quickly replenished his mana reserves. The only condition for using this potion is that it can only be consumed once a day. Otherwise, addiction will set in, and the hunter won't be able to live without a new dose. Despite the limitation, the potion recharged the hero better than expected. Shin saw the confused team, unsure how to handle a monster of this rank. Shin thought they were lucky. Without Craig, things could have been much worse. Arkan could easily handle the Spider Queen of the Legion alone and wouldn't leave a wet spot of the low-ranking hunters, but at least the guild leader could withstand the monster's attacks of this level. Arkan continued his assault with a wicked grin, his claws striking blow after blow with incredible speed. However, Craig was fully focused and managed to fend off the monster's attacks with the help of the sword crafted by Shin. Shin ordered the team to prepare for a fight with Arkan, as he could change targets at any time. John didn't understand why so much confidence came from the low-ranking assistant. Andrew and Anita were also puzzled, realizing that the man was a very powerful hunter. However, Shin explained nothing, merely mentioning that it would be better for the team to focus as they were already under attack by an unstoppable legion of spiders. Shin activated his weapon crafting skills, and a stream of energy burst from his palms. Shin encouraged the team to choose their own fate. He crafted weapons for each member that suited their class. They could take up the weapons and defend themselves from the horde of monsters or try to save their lives by cowardly fleeing the dungeon. Fortunately, all team members chose to stand and fight. The warrior took up his new weapon, delighted with the sword. He had never held such high-quality equipment before. The sword allowed him to easily face the attacking spiders, which was unimaginable before. The blade sliced through the monster's flesh as if passing through butter rather than a dungeon monster's body. Remember, Shin had crafted new weapons for each team member. The warrior checked on the other's performance. Anita gazed at her new staff in awe. She couldn't even dream of having such power. Smiling, she raised her staff above her head and unleashed accumulated energy on her enemies. Dozens of lightning bolts struck the spiders from the cave ceiling, giving the monsters no chance to even approach the group, let alone attack. John was shocked that the team's skills depended so much on the quality of their equipment, as only the weapons in the allies' hands had changed, but their power had increased tenfold. Ordinary spiders no longer posed any threat. John couldn't comprehend what lay hidden behind Shin, who had volunteered to enter the dungeon as a simple assistant. Craig panted despite his experience, already exhausted from fending off Arkan's attacks. He thought he could hold out longer, but even his strength wouldn't be enough to do more without the right weapon. Arkan had suffered significant damage, with his teeth starting to crumble. The monster's body was completely covered in deep wounds oozing green blood. Craig decided to end the boss as quickly as possible and activated his berserker skill. He charged forward and launched an attack, hoping to deliver the final blow that would end Arkan's life. The guild leader leapt high and struck the monster, giving it everything he had. Craig managed to cut off the monster's head, and its lifeless body fell to the ground. He thought he was lucky because his blade could have easily broken after releasing its energy. Glancing at his sword from the corner of his eye, Craig noticed the spiders had become very active. The monsters stopped attacking the team and started running in one direction. The guild leader realized what was happening and ordered the group to retreat. Arkan had activated his ability, making the situation more complicated than before. The Legion spiders began attaching themselves to the boss's body and sacrificing themselves. Gradually, Arkan's wounds healed, and this ability was so powerful that lost limbs regenerated within seconds. The boss managed to rise from the ground, and a smile appeared on the monster's face. Craig analyzed the situation and saw Arkan rising from the dead. The guild leader realized that until the team dealt with all the spiders, the boss would keep regenerating. Craig decided to increase his firepower to eliminate all the Legion spiders in one sweep. However, his sword couldn't withstand the load, and small cracks appeared at its tip. The guild leader vowed that even with this small defect, it wouldn't be possible to continue the assault. Shin smiled and said he did not expect such power from Craig. He explained that although he created the sword from the remaining mana, he still couldn't believe that the guild leader would be able to break it. Fortunately, the hero had completed the creation of a weapon suitable for battle. This sword, although not single-handed, is the strongest the hero could make to date. The guild leader gripped the handle of his new sword tightly and immediately felt all the hidden power within its blade. Craig thought he could destroy anyone with one blow. The sword allowed the leader to fully unleash his berserker skills, causing the ground to crack from the release of energy beneath him. Craig said that although he was not a master swordsman, this seemed to suit him. The guild leader's eyes were filled with light, and his blade was engulfed in blazing flames. He leapt high and raised his sword before delivering a final attack that would instantly end the pitiful Arkan. During the attack, Craig looked like a demon from hell, bringing only destruction to this world. The temperature at the battle center was so high that the boss's face seemed to melt. Finally, Craig struck, and the explosion of energy tore Arkan's body in two, destroying and burning the Legion spiders. Shin observed the scene carefully and learned that Craig was using basic berserker skills. Perhaps this was the first time the guild leader had reached the full potential of this skill. Craig's body was entirely engulfed in flames, as was the massive sword he held in his right hand. Using this skill came with a risk because berserkers would lose their weapon if it was of low quality. The guild leader froze in place until streams of fire began to flow from his mouth. Then there was an explosion in the middle of the room as if someone had planted a bomb in the cave. Finally, the flames slowly subsided and the flashes grew smaller. The sword in the leader's hand was barely burning anymore, and Arkan's green blood covered the blade. Craig thought he had taken a significant risk because if he hadn't released all the energy, he would have gone mad. Seeing the perfectly crafted sword, he thought this was the second time he had fully used the skill since awakening. The guild leader realized he was very wrong when he thought Shin was just making exceptional weapons. Now he was sure that Shin was not an ordinary awakened person. The attention of the entire world would be on this extraordinary hunter. The heroes silently stared at the defeated boss's massive body, whose remains were still burning after Craig's attack. Shin looked up and realized why he was willing to enter the dungeon. This was the core he needed to complete the system's task. Shin decided to step forward cautiously and ask the guild leader one question. The hero wondered if Craig felt the energy emanating from his body. Craig replied that he didn't feel anything, and this time he was sure that Arak must love Shin. This answer was surprising because even high-level hunters didn't feel this kind of mana. Therefore, the man could absorb the energy he needed to move during the quest without fear of running into trouble. The interface told the hero that he had collected the necessary amount of mana to receive the reward. Now Shin had access to the skill of creating demonic weapons, which would be stored upon creation. Shin couldn't even imagine how powerful this equipment would be. He wondered if this equipment was known in his world. The interface showed that Arak had enabled the collection of half the mana needed for the second reward. Craig interrupted Shin's thoughts by calling his name loudly. He asked the leader to listen to him because the man had something to say. The man began to ask what had happened, but he didn't have time to finish his question. Craig started to bow and apologize for constantly inviting the hero to join the guild. The man said he shouldn't have shown such pressure because the man had already refused once. Shin couldn't understand what was happening to the guild leader. Shin expected everything except an apology. He asked the man to stop bowing because he wasn't used to such behavior from others. Johannes couldn't believe his eyes. He stood with his mouth open, unable to utter a word. The knight couldn't believe that such a high-ranking guild leader was bowing to an ordinary assistant. Johannes thought that Shin might be hiding his identity because the man had extraordinary power. The tank turned to check where the other team members were. Andrew and Anita were inspecting the room for monsters and valuable items, reporting that everything was clear. Andrew praised the sword made by Shin, saying that such a weapon was very satisfying for destroying monsters. Anita agreed with her friend and had never met an experienced weapon maker. But Johannes quickly cut the discussion short and said it was time for the team to leave the dungeon and contact the association for a report. Andrew and Anita didn't understand why there was such urgency, especially since the girl wanted to thank the guild leader and Shin for their help. But Johannes literally pushed them out, demanding to leave this disgusting place. The tank just didn't want to get involved in such a big guild's affairs to avoid trouble. Finally, the hero agreed to listen to Craig but asked the man to stop bowing because it was inappropriate behavior for someone of his position. Besides, he was only dealing with an ordinary low-level assistant. Craig said he understood that the hero wasn't interested in joining the guild or working with the guild leader himself. But he still asked the man to accept the tempting terms offered by the guild leader. The hero arrived at the magnificent Overkill Guild building. Lucy greeted him and said she was glad to see him again. She introduced herself as the Overkill Guild's secretary and was responsible for signing contracts. Shin thanked the girl for her work and said he didn't expect such a quick meeting. Lucy explained that the guild leader asked not to delay anything and that everything had to be ready in the morning. The contract will be signed in the guild's private reception room, where the confidentiality of the process need not be worried about. The girl invited Shin to review the contract, which reiterated the terms explained by the guild master in the dungeon. Shin read the contract carefully to ensure the terms were correct. He smiled with satisfaction. As the guild master had said, on paper, the proposal looked more convincing. Finally, the hero returned the contract to the table and confirmed his agreement. In the dungeon, Craig had offered the job at the guild informally. He understood the hero's need to conceal his identity, although not entirely. But the guild master promised to provide Shin with equipment, materials, and portal rights. Shin wondered how he deserved the favor from one of the largest guilds. Craig revealed only one condition for the privileges granted, which was to complete specific tasks. At the same time, the guild master did not demand absolute obedience from the hero. First and foremost, signing the contract was necessary so that the man could not join another guild. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. It was a team from the Hunter Association coming to ensure everything was alright with the guildmaster. The guildmaster said it was time to conclude the talk and leave the dungeon. He hoped the hero would accept his offer because Persik was very eager to gain such a strong ally. Overall, Shin's plan was going as expected. The man wanted to convince the guildmaster to continue working with Overkill without joining the organization. Lucy mentioned that the hero could ask for anything he needed since he had signed the contract. She took a small box from her bag, which Craig had requested to be given as a gift. The hero took the box in his hands and wondered what was inside. He opened the gift, and a magical purple light emanated from the box. Shin looked inside, his expression showing no emotion. He thanked Lucy for the gift and quickly put the box in his backpack. Along the way, the hero took out a tablet with a list of items he needed. The girl checked the list of requested equipment and could not hide her surprise. Lucy said that the list was very extensive and would take at least a week to find and acquire everything. But the girl noted that the likelihood of these items being useful to a hunter with Shin's specialization was very small. The man said he did not ask for everything for himself but wanted to provide some equipment to others. In the afternoon, the hero arrived at the Hunter Association to find a girl and carry out his cunning plan. The association office was already half empty because the hunters preferred to handle their business in the morning or evening after completing their tasks. Shin impatiently looked at his phone screen and constantly checked the time. He thought that the person he was waiting for should have arrived a long time ago, and it was strange that she was late. Finally, Shin looked up and saw the girl he wanted to talk to entering the association building awkwardly, as if afraid of seeing someone or accidentally hurting someone. A beam of energy pierced through the trees and leaves in the tranquil summer forest. It made a large hole not only in the wood but also in the body of the unlucky goblin in its path. This was the goddess archer Lexi, and the beam of energy came from the arrow the girl shot at the enemy. In the future, Lexi would become a player and reveal her talent. Currently, the girl could barely find the strength to speak with the office staff. Finally, Lexi gathered her words and shyly requested training permission at the gate. She placed her hunter ID card on the table. The officer checked the documents and granted Lexi permission for the C-rank gate since she was a first-rank hunter. It was even more embarrassing for her to explain that she wanted permission for the D-rank gate. Such a request confused the officer because hunters of such a high rank usually did not use lower-level dungeons. In his mind, the officer thought that it was the first time he had seen someone with such awakened skills doing so few missions. Finally, he asked the girl to fill out a form to confirm her training leave request. The office worker thought that it was likely Lexi's rank would soon decrease because streams of energy were flowing through the cracks in the sky and penetrating everyone. The amount of mana stored in the body determines how strong a hunter's abilities are. This is how awakened individuals are divided into classes. The more mana, the higher the rank. At the same time, ranks are not fixed values. They can rise or fall depending on the success or failure of the awakened individual. For example, if Lexi continues to go only to low-level dungeons, her rank will soon drop. The office worker accepted the request and verified the completed form. He asked if Lexi would be going to the dungeon alone and what was required for that. The secretary replied that only groups of 2 were allowed to enter the gate, but hunters could take on a challenge to pass solo once. The girl felt scared at the idea of taking the test and immediately refused. The office worker reminded Lexi about the application procedures. Lexi was informing the secretary that she would receive a ranking update at the end of the month. To secure her ranking, Lexi needed to complete a level C dungeon or a level challenge. One of the association staff suggested she choose a test that she would automatically receive and wished her good luck. Shin was watching from the sidelines, listening carefully while pretending to look at his phone. As she left the building, Lexi thought it would be better to request a portal online because crowds intimidated her, but she decided to attend in person to ensure she wouldn't risk being downgraded. She recalled her past failures in going to the portal and hoped it wouldn't happen again. A message about the availability of a training portal arrived almost immediately. Lexi thought she would have to wait a few days until a dungeon and a partner were found. Therefore, she quickly sent her approval to participate so as not to miss the opportunity. Although new portals opened almost every day, each new portal still attracted a crowd of onlookers. Lexi prepared herself with battle gear and steeled herself mentally for success. At the portal, she met Shin, who called out to her as she was still mentally adjusting at the portal entrance. Shin mentioned his name and introduced himself as a support hunter who would assist Lexi in the mission. She suddenly bowed and thanked him for agreeing to go with her. Shin apologized for his tardiness and offered to begin the journey. In the memories acquired from the system, Lexi's ranking was downgraded to rank C due to her continuous failures in qualification tests, But thanks to the player system, she still revealed her talent and became a goddess of archery. Fortunately, Shin knew the kind of talent Lexi would acquire in the future and would awaken it in the portal, as this did not require participation in the system. On the other side of the portal, the heroes encountered a goblin patrol scouting the area. Lexi peeked from behind the bushes and checked the direction the enemies were heading. She felt relieved realizing the goblins were taking a different path away from the heroes. She looked at her hand and thanked herself for the successful purchase. She bought a bracelet that tracked mana changes in close proximity to the wearer. Lexi remembered she forgot to talk to her partner about the dungeon conditions. She explained that she would go alone and wanted to kill the enemies herself for practice. She promised to give all the loot as compensation and pay for the time spent, but Shin was not interested in the dungeon loot. He asked her not to worry about it. Lexi thanked her partner for understanding and stood up to begin the training. She took her first arrow from the quiver and drew her bow, aiming at the goblin. She was very focused and decided not to rush and chose the right moment to strike. Finally, Lexi released the bowstring, and the arrow flew towards the enemy at high speed. The projectile flew so fast that the goblin's reaction wasn't enough to dodge the shot. Moments later, half of the monster's head was destroyed by the powerful archer's attack. However, the remaining goblins stayed alert. The arrow flew past them, and the green-skinned bandit started searching for the source of the threat. Without wasting time, she sent the next projectile, but this time her hand shook and her shot missed. She failed to kill even one enemy. Shin noticed that Lexi's destructive power far exceeded the first rank, but with accuracy like this, her skills were useless as she couldn't reach close range. Almost hitting one of the 3 arrows and noticing this quietly, he killed the remaining 4 enemies in 2 shots, primarily because the arrows were almost depleted. However, the archer wasn't allowed to focus on the shot because a sudden sound came from the forest. One of the goblins used a horn to call for help. Lexi was confused. She didn't expect that the monster could use additional equipment. In less than a minute, reinforcements arrived to assist the goblins. She started to feel nervous, sweating, and it became increasingly difficult for her to aim. The mana-detecting bracelet started vibrating intensely on her wrist, adding to the tension. Lexi realized she was surrounded, and the goblins were preparing to attack simultaneously. Her mind began racing. She didn't know whether to attack the enemy in front of her or behind her. Goblins leaped from ambush and almost attacked the hesitant girl from behind. Their path was blocked by dozens of energy blades embedded in the ground. Shin emerged from hiding in the forest and asked Lexi to help him immediately. She was astonished by the unusual abilities of a rank D creator and wondered why the hero had lied about his rank. However, Shin assured her he was honest. Because of his low rank, the barrier wouldn't last long. Finally, Lexi lost her patience and wondered what she should do. Shin turned and pointed to a group of goblins in the forest, asking Lexi to shoot in that direction with all her remaining power. The archer agreed and immediately turned, drawing her bow, and mana began to flow along the arrow. Finally, Lexi shot, and the arrow turned into a large projectile, clearing a path for the heroes. Shin took her hand and said this was not the right time to stop and ask questions. After all, the goblins wouldn't wait until the heroes finished talking, and they were already approaching. With a smile on his face, Shin began to run, pulling Lexi with him. Shin's plan went perfectly. The heroes only stopped after running several kilometers and finally arrived at the correct cave. Lexi was nearly choking. She wasn't used to such physical and mental pressure. The archer didn't understand where they had run and whether the heroes had managed to escape from the goblins. She recalled the fear she felt while fleeing quickly and how the terrifying goblins almost caught the heroes in the forest. Her thoughts were in chaos. She barely understood what had happened and how to get out of this situation. Most surprisingly, she was amazed that Shin remained entirely calm. Lexi decided it was time to finish the journey and told Shin she would definitely compensate him. However, he refused. It was still too dangerous for the heroes to leave the dungeon because the goblins would remain alert and active around the area for some time. Moreover, the heroes lost their light while fleeing, so they had to wait until the monsters left. Lexi didn't like this situation. She asked how long it would take. Shin replied that goblins usually patrolled the area for about an hour. Clearly, Lexi didn't like the possibility of being stuck in the dungeon for a long time. She fell to her knees, remembering the heroes would soon be done. Shin reinforced the story. Usually, goblins searched for fleeing prey for about half an hour, but he was glad that the girl in this condition was ready to believe anything and didn't realize the deception. He hoped to explore the cave as soon as possible, which was part of Shin's plan. He could only convince the girl to enter with him and think about the plan. He was sure that Lexi would panic and flee once he mentioned the journey into the dark cave. Finally, Lexi took a breath and calmed down a bit. She began speaking with Shin, apologizing and thinking the situation was her fault. The archer nearly cried, her voice trembling. Shin couldn't even utter a few words. His breath flowed heavily as he realized that even in this low-level dungeon, he still made beginner mistakes. Lexi remembered one of her past invasions and couldn't hold it anymore, tears streaming down her face. Shin bit his finger to bring the archer back to her senses and asked her to fulfill one request. He said that since they still had plenty of time before returning, they could chat on the way while exploring the mysterious cave ahead. The girl agreed to fulfill the request, and the heroes entered the cave. On the way, Lexi asked the hero why he needed help. The hero warned that even though he had a high rank, he had almost no experience in dungeons. Shin realized that the girl had never been to a training gate and told her that this cave was always inhabited by elite monsters. For personal reasons, he wanted to kill the monster and therefore needed the help of a high-level hunter. Shin played on her emotions and said that she was the first person to agree to help him as a supporter. Lexi accepted the information in silence, clearly touched by the hero's words. Finally, the archer stopped and firmly agreed to help him with his difficult task. She recalled how, with Shin's help, they managed to escape from the goblin trap. Moreover, she knew from experience how disappointing it was not to be accepted into any team. Her bracelet began vibrating, indicating the presence of a mana source nearby. The heroes stopped, and Shin turned on his spotlight to see what was inside the cave. A large elite monster emerged from the darkness, its head almost touching the cave ceiling. Lexi immediately ran forward, asking the hero to move away from the threat while aiming her bow. The mana-infused arrow glowed bright blue as she aimed the projectile directly at the target, but the monster easily withstood the shot with its massive club. Lexi didn't expect such a reaction from the clumsy giant. For a moment, she froze with her mouth open in surprise, but she quickly regained focus and drew another arrow. As her hand began to tremble, panic slowly crept into her mind. She forced herself to shoot, as now was not the time to give up. Lexi turned away, and what she saw made her feel sick. The monster paused hesitantly and resumed its attack, swinging the club as large as the two heroes to strike them. The archer froze in fear, unable to move to save her life. Shin came to the rescue, grabbing her by the collar and suddenly tossing Lexi out of the path of the blow that would have certainly killed her. Unable to get up, the archer could only witness the horrific sight of the act of revenge. The giant struck the cave floor, causing the cave walls to tremble and clouds of dust to scatter from beneath its club. In her confusion, Lexi tried to find out where Shin was, not knowing whether he had managed to dodge the attack. This situation reminded the girl of a few years ago when she bravely entered the gate for the first time. A girl from Lexi's team accused the archer of having poor shooting skills. In addition, that teammate claimed that Lexi almost killed her with her arrow. Since then, the archer was not wanted on any team and was considered a failure by others. Team members who went with her to the first dungeon spread rumors that the girl preferred to kill her own people rather than hit monsters. Lexi's life turned into a nightmare, everyone around her avoided her, and she felt very lonely. Once again, the archer thought that she should have given up on the idea of becoming a hunter after her first failure. She was convinced that the giant had killed Shin and blamed herself for his death. However, Shin turned out to be alive and well. With his abilities, dying at the hands of a Class D monster would have been a disgrace. Shin used his cloning ability and prevented the next attack from the elite monster. Shin shouted to Lexi that she just needed to listen to him and stay calm, then they would win. Shin had prepared a surprise that would be useful in an emergency. The hero continued to ask Lexi to pay close attention and see the monster's weak spot. The girl felt her senses suddenly heighten, even though she didn't understand why. She stood up, making sure that her feelings did not deceive her. The archer's left eye glowed with a golden flame as if she were hypnotized. Now Lexi knew exactly where to target to ensure the monster was defeated with one shot. The girl drew her bow with confident hands, a stream of energy flowing from her hands to the arrow. For a moment, Lexi closed her eyes and focused only on the projectile and the target. When she opened her eyes, she was ready to defeat the monster without hesitation. Her arrow turned into a golden ball of energy and shot toward the monster at high speed. The green giant managed to turn and see where the threat was coming from. Shin held his breath, convinced he had done everything right. The monster was still able to raise its club to defend against the attack, but the stream of energy was so strong that it shattered the weapon and pierced the giant's body. Shin watched what happened with a smile, convinced that his plan had worked. The archer stared at her opponent, unable to say a word, not expecting that she had such power. The shot was so strong that it pierced the giant's hand holding the club. In the monster's body was a large hole through which another part of the cave could be seen. Finally, the giant fell on its back with a loud thud and was still. The fight was over. Lexi gasped, not having experienced such tension in a long time, and was very surprised by her ability. Shin approached the girl and said that the incident was risky, but the archer was finally able to fight with her full strength. Lexi began to ask questions one by one, wondering who Shin really was and why he acted as if he knew everything in advance and what he meant by his words about awakening talent. The hero asked the girl not to rush because they still had plenty of time to talk on the way out of the gate. The archer began to demand answers, threatening to punish him if they were not given. Suddenly, she stopped talking and froze in her place with a strange expression on her face. The girl held her head and complained softly, clearly her condition worsening. The sound of her body falling echoed throughout the cave, bouncing off the walls. Shin placed the girl on his shoulder and sighed heavily, dragging the archer out of the cave, thinking that allies sometimes really became a burden. The hero consoled himself that the day was successful and that the girl's ability had been fully revealed. Once Lexi regained consciousness, she felt embarrassed about her behavior in the cave. She apologized to Shin for doubting his sincerity, as the man had saved her life twice. Shin reassured the girl, saying everything was fine and she didn't need to worry. He asked her to stop apologizing, as Lexi had been pleading for forgiveness for half an hour since she came to. Shin extended his hand and asked the girl to return the necklace that was in her pocket. Lexi reached into her pocket and tried to take out the gem, her hands still trembling from the tension she had experienced. Finally, she managed to take out the amulet and handed it to Shin. Shin examined the necklace under the sunlight and, from the change in the gem's color, understood that it had been successfully activated. It was a rare piece of equipment obtained from the burnt harpy hideout. The necklace activated the enhanced senses skill, but with the strict condition that the owner of the gem must feel strong emotions in certain situations. The amulet was activated when facing imminent death, and enhanced senses were used, for example, to dodge an arrow flying toward them. After examining the stone, Shin returned it to the girl because she would still need it. Shin thought that fear was the most suitable emotion for the archer, although it turned out to be very difficult to make her feel the right emotion. Shin wanted to carry out his plan earlier, but it was difficult to find the stone in stock, even though its price was high. Craig helped the hero obtain the amulet and found it in just 2 days. While fighting the elite monster, the archer only felt her hidden potential. Lexi still has a lot to learn, so Shin gives her advice on how to act better in battle. He recommends switching her short bow for a long bow to work from a distance and practicing more against monsters to overcome her fear of enemies. Lexi listens intently to Shin's instructions and offers very useful advice, but suddenly she interrupts her speech and starts speaking shyly, asking Shin to listen to her until the end. Shin is surprised but pauses and asks Lexi to continue. Lexi first thanks Shin for saving her life and giving her a magical necklace during the battle in the cave. She was terrified but then felt the energy from the necklace, which gave her incredible strength and confidence, erasing all her fears at that moment. Lexi began to see all the weak points on the elite monster and realized where to direct her attacks. The archer feels embarrassed and says that even though her abilities are high, she is always hindered by self-doubt. However, in the short time since meeting Shin, Lexi has grown more than she did in years of trying on her own. Lexi interrupts again and says that maybe Shin is already bored with her story, but Shin reassures the archer and promises to give her his number so she can contact him if needed. Lexi is delighted, her cheeks turning red, as she rarely communicates with others, let alone makes friends. A message arrives on Shin's phone, and he quickly pulls it out of his pocket. It's from Craig, asking Shin to contact him immediately. After completing the mission in the dungeon, Shin calls the guild leader. Craig needs help from a weapons maker, although the situation is still unclear, but something dangerous is coming. Shin readily agrees to help because the guild leader has helped him a lot by finding the magical necklace for Lexi. Craig thanks Shin for his response and is glad the necklace was useful. After hanging up the phone, there's a soft knock on his office door. Craig goes to the door and invites the guest to enter. It's Lucy, who states that the association chairman has returned to the office and it's time to move on to the meeting. Craig and his assistant walk down the hall, their footsteps echoing in the guild's empty corridors. Lucy thinks about the reason for her visit to the association and reaches a disappointing conclusion, saying that the organization's chairman usually sends important instructions through messages. Lucy finds it strange that no official document has been received, suggesting that the situation is so serious that the chairman must be summoned in person. Perhaps the highest-ranked gate in the city has reopened, which only Craig and people like him can handle. But the guild leader reassures Lucy and says that Shin has already agreed to help, and if he fights with full strength as before, there's nothing to worry about. Craig thinks that he insisted on signing a contract with Shin for a reason and smiles. Lucy notices the change in her boss's mood, which has become more optimistic lately. However, she feels puzzled about how the guild leader can give unlimited support to a hunter like Shin and points out that even though hunters can be emotional, Craig is one of the most balanced and rational people she knows. It's unlikely that an experienced hunter like him is impressed by some jewelry made by a low-level weapons maker. Lucy feels the need to know more details because Craig rarely contacts Shin and even less frequently invites him to the guild in person. Finally, they arrive at the Hunter Association chairman's office. At the entrance, they are greeted by a security guard who explains the reason for Craig's solo arrival. The guild leader replies that he doesn't know the other participants in the meeting. The guard says that another guild chairman is expected to attend, and Craig must wait. The guild leader asks who the second participant in the meeting is, but the guard sees a man joining the meeting behind the heroes. The association member greets the newly arrived guild leader. Craig and Lucy turn to the familiar voice, and Jared waves at the people gathered at the guild leader's office door. In her mind, Lucy feels unhappy seeing Jared and would rather not be in the same building with him. Jared smiles broadly and says he never expected to see members of the Overkill Guild here. Jared is the only person in the country who can make Craig lose his temper. Pretending not to see well, Jared approaches Craig, bends slightly, and sarcastically asks how the supposedly unknown guild leader is doing. Craig's and Lucy's faces become darker than clouds, and they can't hold back Jared's antics, but he still doesn't relent and says that the Overkill Guild's problem is not its staff but the stupidity of its leader. Craig pushes Jared away and says there is no time for foolish provocations. Jared laughed and said that nothing was more important to the guild leader than the low-level gate he frequently visited. Even Lucy couldn't hold back any longer. She stepped forward and asked Jared to explain himself. Jared started ranting about how Craig went into the gate to kill newcomers. Lucy began to defend her leader, but Craig told her not to give in to the provocation. Craig then asked the guards to let them into the office as it was time to start the meeting. The guards opened the office door and started to announce the arrival of the guild leader, but the leader cut him off, having already heard the argument in the corridor, and asked for invitations for the guests. Lucy sat near the office door, waiting for Craig, and a security guard, feeling embarrassed, offered her a cup of tea, which she declined. The association leader began providing information to the young leaders, mentioning that a gate with an undefined rank had appeared on the outskirts of the city. Craig thought the gate was malfunctioning and discussed it with director Jacob, but Jacob responded that the gate was so unusual that it was impossible to measure its mana level. Jared, hearing about such a dungeon for the first time, raised his eyebrows in surprise. Craig was also shocked by such a statement, noting that even a malfunctioning gate could be measured using special tools. Experts typically measure the amount of mana in a gate, so a dungeon's level usually doesn't depend on the monsters inhabiting it. The association then sent scouts to confirm the gate's level. However, in this case, they couldn't determine the dungeon's level with existing measuring equipment. After failing to measure it, the leader sent several scout teams, but none of the dozens sent returned. Jared suddenly stood up angrily and asked why no one reported this unknown gate. Jacob ignored the question and continued talking about the gate's barrier, which could disappear at any time, allowing monsters to break through, which would bring no good. The guild leaders were reminded of the consequences of similar incidents in the past. Jacob apologized for his boldness but said that refusing to participate in the operation was unacceptable. He asked everyone to forget past differences and work together for the security of the entire country. The leader wanted to contact the third guild leader for assistance, but he was abroad. Jacob gave the leaders 2 days to prepare and promised to cover all expenses and provide a large reward for those who participated in the mission. Craig asked if the teams involved would only consist of guild members. The leader replied that the situation was urgent and anyone trustworthy could join the mission. Craig smiled, knowing he would bring Shin, which would make clearing the dungeon much easier. Jared returned to his guild headquarters feeling annoyed. He threw off his jacket and ordered his subordinates to gather the best available team. He was displeased with Craig's smile during the meeting, suspecting that Craig was plotting something. Jared had always considered Master Overkill his rival and was furious at the thought of losing to him. Suddenly, he had a brilliant but dark idea and ordered his men to find a girl. Jared's assistant was frightened by the mention of the witch's name, but the leader wouldn't hear any objections and demanded Kate be recruited into their team by any means necessary. He was confident that with such an ally, he could ruin the reputation of the Overkill Guild. 2 days later, Craig's team arrived at the unknown gate. To avoid causing panic in the country, the leader limited the number of participants to the 4 most trusted individuals and, if possible, instructed them to carry out the mission discreetly. Melissa began to feel anxious because the Manhwa Guild representatives had not yet arrived. Jax assured her there was still time and asked her to calm down. Melissa nervously twirled her pistol, unable to stand the attitude of the rival guild members. She asked if a bullet to the head could teach manners. Jax quickly slapped her on the head, warning that such remarks could provoke unnecessary conflict in the field. Melissa noted that the vice leader of the guild was very strong, but such words only made Jax angrier. He asked again who she called rude and started chasing her to teach her some manners. Craig thanked Shin for agreeing to help. The leader thought Shin would refuse, but Shin explained that Craig had helped him by obtaining a rare amulet for an archer, so he wanted to return the favor. Shin also respected Craig. In fact, Shin's gratitude was the main reason for joining this cleansing mission. 5 days ago, the system gave the heroes a hidden mission that had to be completed in this gate. Completing such rare missions could provide awakeners with not only valuable equipment but also new abilities. Craig interrupted the hero's thoughts and suddenly apologized in advance for Jared's behavior. The Manhwa Guild team had just come out of the forest. The leader apologized with a smile for the delay, citing ongoing work in his guild, unlike the Overkill guild which didn't have much work. Jared smirked and reminded Craig to go to the lower level gates again. Melissa trembled just by seeing the members of the Manhwa guild, and Jax asked her to calm down. The girl had already started to swear, but the vice chairman covered her mouth with his large hand. The Overkill and Manhwa guilds have always competed for the top position in the country. Shin thought the media only made things worse by continuously publishing contradictory articles about which guild was more deserving of being called the best. Jared finally noticed the main hero and looked at him in surprise. He was the only member of Craig's team who was not registered. The leader of Manhwa realized that this was Overkill's guild trump card. Jared laughed out loud and tried to insult the main hero. Even the Manhwa overseer began to think that Craig was just joking and that the dungeon clearing was just a joke to him. Shin listened to Jared's lecture in silence and decided not to respond to the provocation. The tank from the Manhwa team asked the leader to calm down and not start trouble from the beginning. Moreover, a newcomer was also fighting alongside them today. A girl came out from the back row and asked to hurry up because there was still much to do. Melissa recognized the famous Valeria and was horrified by this team's lineup. This girl was the strongest element master in Korea and could use all 6 elements. Melissa was unsure if Shin could match the unique Valeria, but she hoped the Overkill guild leader was wrong. Finally, the girl greeted her allies and suggested starting the gate clearing. According to her, it would be easy, but from future memories, Shin knew that this gate was very dangerous. In this reality, the previous clearing mission had failed. Of the 8 awakeners who entered the high-level gate, only Craig managed to get out using his skills. After that, the gate suddenly disappeared, and the rest were presumed dead behind the gate. The heroes were not faced with an ordinary cave full of monsters, but a luxurious palace with large statues that served as enemies. Jared easily destroyed the enemies with just one hand. Shin observed the battle and couldn't understand why it was so easy. A few minutes earlier, the team had entered the gate and seen the palace for the first time. Suddenly, the gate behind Jack started making strange noises, unusual for a normal gate. A second later, the large carved doors slammed shut with a loud noise, blocking the exit from the dungeon behind them. Jax tried his best to open the way, but failed. Now 3 awakeners were trying, if not to open the door, then at least to break it into pieces. Not long after, the door closed automatically with a loud bang, surprising everyone. Once it was shut, the vice guild leader tried to open it again, but it wouldn't budge. Some people attempted to force it open with attacks, but the door didn't move at all despite their efforts. Jared, seeing this, tried to open it himself, but before he could, several puppet-like creatures with red eyes and made outfits suddenly appeared and attacked. Jared fought back with his punches, quickly sending the puppets flying and shattering their bodies. Everyone else stayed alert, knowing the enemy could strike unexpectedly like before. A surprising event occurred. The shattered statues began to rise and recover. The ability to revive? Very interesting, Jared said, laughing happily and readying his skills. 2 large hands appeared beside him, a remarkable skill. Jared then slammed the statue with his large hands, driving it into the ground. Others joined in the attack. You're not in the betting pool, are you? So, what about you? Shin said, explaining that he only supported them through weapon production, while Yeren remarked that she wasn't keen on putting an effort for such a team. That's why Yeren joined this red dungeon. She felt a little excited and had heard that Korea's strongest hunter was there, but they didn't meet her expectations. They couldn't defeat the puppets. If Yeren had known it would be like this, she would have declined the invitation from the Manhwa guild. According to Shin, the puppets were strange because the contaminated monsters didn't take normal forms. Then Shin noticed something. He saw strings on the puppets' bodies and tried to trace where they came from. Following the strings, he spotted an object on the ceiling, and all the strings were connected to it. In truth, Shin didn't want to show off his skills, but there was a great chance of defeating the puppets if someone destroyed that object. Feeling he had the ability to erase memories, Shin intended to destroy the object. Suddenly, Yeren prepared to unleash her skill in the form of S-crystals that electrocuted insects. Yeren only used her skill to kill things she wanted dead. For instance, if there were insects nearby, Yeren could easily kill them with her electric element. Shin realized Yeren was actually afraid of insects, which was why she only killed them. At the same time, Shin executed his plan using Yeren's power to destroy the object. The object was contaminated, and only Shin could see it. Shin's plan began. He pointed upward and used his skill to create a replica of an insect monster. Shin placed the insect right next to the object suspected of being the source of contamination, successfully luring Yeren to use her skill on it. Yeren also directed her fire element at the insect. The artificial insect Shin made was destroyed, along with the object. Jared was confused because Yeren suddenly directed her fire attack there, but soon after, the puppets stopped moving. They were all puzzled by what happened. The puppets suddenly ceased to move, and Shin's hunch was correct. The object was the source of the puppet's revival ability. If Shin hadn't been able to see the contamination, he might not have found it, and the object could have been why the red dungeon failed in the past. This time, they managed to clear the lobby, but to be sure, they continued checking the entire first floor, led by the deputy leader of the Overkill Guild. As expected, they still encountered other puppets along the way. "Move aside, I'll go first," Jared said excitedly, eager to defeat the puppets, while Shin always managed to locate objects suspected of being contaminated by mana. Then Shin instructed Melissa to shoot at the spot he pointed out. Although Sung Jae-ho didn't understand, he obeyed. Melissa's shot successfully destroyed the object, and they resolved the problem easily. In this way, they explored the entire room and completed the first floor with relative ease. This time they continued their journey to the second floor. "Come this way," Craig said, while Jared suddenly felt irritated because Craig ignored him. Jared thought he might have pushed himself too hard in the earlier fight. Meanwhile, Shin still felt uneasy, even though Craig's earlier words seemed reassuring. But to be certain, Shin wanted to inspect the room himself, and sure enough, Shin found something like a thread wrapped around an object. More precisely, it was contaminated mana. While the others were now fighting something that attacked at high speed, Jared couldn't use his skills because he had to hold his ground. "Are you all okay?" Craig asked. They struggled to fend off each incoming attack, then said they were fine, except they couldn't see anyone else under Craig. They were referring to Shin. Craig was surprised to realize that Shin was not with them, while Shin himself was elsewhere, still busy absorbing the contaminated mana. Then Shin heard Craig's voice calling his name repeatedly. Shin realized that the others were in a difficult battle, but fortunately, he had finished absorbing all the mana. However, when Shin wanted to rejoin the others immediately, he suddenly saw a figure appear. It turned out to be just a little girl carrying a doll. Shin was shocked. How could there be a little girl in a dungeon like this, let alone what was she doing in such a place? "You're a hunter, aren't you?" said the girl. Then the girl told Shin to follow her. She knew Shin was a hunter because her older sister, who was below, had told her that a hunter would come to save her sister and that she would leave with the hunter when the time came. According to the girl, Shin's presence here meant he was the hunter who would save her sister, so he followed the little girl. However, the girl felt strange because, even though she was sure Shin was the hunter her sister mentioned, Shin seemed unaware of the situation. After assessing the situation, Shin was quite certain the woman had been affected by a serious mental attack. Shin then tried talking to her, explaining he had been sent to the dungeon by the Korean Hunters Association. Hearing the words Hunters Association, the woman immediately responded. Shin then asked her to explain her situation. The woman explained that she was the fourth scout sent into the dungeon. Since the first 3 scouts hadn't returned, she was ordered to investigate and search for the third scout. However, once inside the dungeon, dolls from all directions began running towards her. She was so shocked that she tried to exit through the gate, but the door closed and wouldn't open, trapping her inside. Yes, the situation was the same for Shin. The woman kept calling the other scouts to check the entrance, but something strange happened. The scouts seemed unaware and suddenly tried to attack her, so she ran away and eventually met the child. She felt helped by the child, whose name was Elizabeth Colbett. Shin then suggested they leave together since the dungeon was very dangerous, but Elizabeth replied that it was even more dangerous outside. Back at Craig's location, they were still enduring the attacks. Craig's enemy realized something. The disguise technique the enemy was using was gradually fading, and the enemy seemed about to reveal himself. Suddenly, the enemy dropped something resembling a personal ID card, according to Craig. It must have been a scout's ID card, and his face matched the missing scout document Craig had received from the association. It turned out the enemy attacking them was the scout previously declared missing. Disguise is a skill that can't be used for several minutes after its duration ends, and it drastically reduces movement speed. Initially, he thought it was a monster capable of using disguise skills, but it was just a scout. Jared intended to kill them all in one breath this time, but suddenly something scratched his nose, causing it to bleed. It was Melissa who stopped Jared. According to Melissa, they weren't monsters but people who needed saving. There might even be a way to return the scouts to their original state. But Jared said that, in the current situation, there were only 2 options, kill or be killed. Jared didn't care who they were. If they showed hostility towards him, he would deal with them, including Melissa, because she had shot him before. If Melissa tried to stop Jared again this time, Jared would kill Melissa before the scouts. Craig then spoke up, attempting to stop Jared and asked him to listen first. Craig made a deal with Jared. Craig would give all the rewards and funding for the Red Dungeon to the Manhwa Guild. Finally, Jared agreed and gave Craig time to find a way to return the scouts to normal. But if time ran out and Craig hadn't found a solution, Jared would destroy the dolls. Among the dolls, one looked very intimidating. Elizabeth herself didn't know how, but they were covered in purple threads that wouldn't die unless removed, and they would continue attacking relentlessly. Plus, the threads were strong and difficult to destroy. Shin also asked Elizabeth if they could return to normal as before because if they could, he wanted to help his colleague return to normal. According to Elizabeth, someone had to stop the device attached to the doll's body when the thread was severed. However, if the thread was cutting correctly, the person's body would be destroyed. Shin was surprised that, even with such a difficult question, Elizabeth could answer with an explanation without hesitation and also be kind. "Should I ask once again?" Shin said, returning to the other battle. They endured while thinking of ways to return the Parker to its normal state. In seconds, after its disguise, recovery occurred. However, if they weren't successful, they would all die. The countdown started from T, growing more tense as it reached 1. Jared prepared to throw his punch, but at the same time, the pain felt by the game returned, and consequently, his skill use was cancelled or failed. "Huh, you stopped that ability just in time. We barely saved them. Leave it to me from here," said Shin, who had just arrived with Elizabeth. Continuing from the previous story, Shin arrived at his team's location with a little girl named Elizabeth. Shin said the reason he left earlier was that he had to check something first, which left his team behind. After checking, Shin found nothing unusual and told his team not to worry too much. Craig was relieved that nothing strange had happened and that John was back in good condition. However, according to Craig, this was a dungeon, so it was better not to act alone. Soon after, John's team was shocked by Scout because Scout could now use his abilities again. It was a secret ability they hadn't seen. Knowing this, Craig immediately became alert, protecting Shin and the little girl behind him while Scout quickly moved and attacked them together. But this time, it seemed Scout targeted Shin and the girl behind him. Thanks to the threads made of contaminated mana, Shin could clearly see their shape. The threads completely covered Scout's body, and thanks to Shin's abilities, he could finally see Scout's doll's weak spot. Shin would mark them first before finally attacking Scout's weak point. After Shin successfully identified the weak point, he asked his team members for assistance so they could target it accurately, ensuring the Scout's body wasn't destroyed. Craig understood what Shin meant. The markings, like blue fragments, were clearly visible even when the Scout couldn't be seen, allowing Craig and the others to easily track its movements and target its weak spot. Without hesitation, Craig immediately attacked with the hilt of his sword. The strike hit the mark, impacting the weak point Shin had previously identified. He successfully took down one Scout, which then retreated and stopped moving. "I didn't expect they could actually be targeted this way," Craig said. To simplify the information, Craig explained briefly, succinctly, and clearly to Jared's team that the blue circle in the center was the parachute's weak point. Eventually, Jared's team attacked precisely at the weak point and managed to stop the parachutes without damaging their original bodies. "Why did they suddenly stop?" Jared asked, surprised. "Actually, they aren't broken, they just stopped moving and aren't attacking anymore," Craig replied. Feeling secure, Craig asked Shin about something. Craig was curious about what Shin had checked on the first floor earlier. Shin told him that he hadn't found anything special while inspecting the place. He was merely investigating the dungeon when he happened to encounter a little girl and brought her to the location of a Scout that had survived. The Scout was already mentally affected and couldn't accompany him. The next question was about the child Shin had brought along. They were very curious about the information regarding the child Shin had brought. Shin didn't elaborate in detail, simply stating that the child helped him find the weak point and a way to strengthen the Scout without destroying its original body. However, Jared was skeptical about a child suddenly appearing in the dungeon. He believed that the child's parents might be trapped in the dungeon. "That's suspicious," Jared said. Meanwhile, Loli, a woman with firearm skills, was furious at Jared for suspecting a cute-looking child with an adorable smile. Jared also felt emotional, claiming he wasn't wrong to say that because, logically, how could a Loli suddenly be in the dungeon without a detailed explanation? If the reason was that Loli was lost, that was also unlikely because, according to him, the dungeon's location had been kept secret and the association always guarded the entrance gate tightly. Shin tried to calm the dispute between them, saying he understood Jared's reasoning but that it wasn't good to judge someone too quickly. "You're just looking for faults in what I said, right? Damn it, you keep acting like a loser because I'm going easy on you. Should I kill all your guild members?" Jared said, not accepting Craig's statement. "You know I don't like meaningless fights, but I think now it's necessary to teach you a lesson in this red dungeon, right?" Craig said, also not accepting Jared's statement. Eventually, the team members also became emotional. They were all equally emotional after their guild leaders argued, and even each guild leader was ready to use their signature moves. Craig used his fire abilities while Jared used his ice abilities. Meanwhile, Shin felt something was off. This time, he could sense that both parties' emotions continued to rise, and neither was willing to back down. "What is really happening in a situation like this?" John asked. Then the little girl spoke, revealing her true nature. She said that all she did was push their emotions slightly, but she hadn't expected that their emotions would actually trigger a dispute and even a fight like this. "Ha, that's truly pathetic, the little girl said. It turned out that the little girl received help from her boss, allowing her to use mind control abilities on humans. Eventually, the little girl managed to get this far without being suspected when Shin first met her. Shin had already suspected that the little girl was a monster, and the question for himself was when he started thinking that the little girl was just an ordinary child. The biggest possibility was that Shin had been brainwashed since he first saw the little girl. Now it was too late, even though Shin was beginning to realize it. Shin also tried to stop the little girl before his friends were brainwashed. If that happened, it would be challenging to get them all back unless the little girl was stopped. As Shin was about to attack the little girl without realizing it, threads contaminated with mana were already wrapped around his body. Shin also realized that the threads were binding the others as well. How could everyone be brainwashed? I didn't expect her to use contaminated mana to manipulate not only the physical but also the mind. I failed to see through her lies from the beginning, Shin thought, but it seemed the girl was mistaken. She had made Shin her opponent without knowing he possessed a unique mana absorption ability that could absorb contaminated mana. They returned to consciousness thanks to Shin's ability, which successfully absorbed and severed the threads of contamination. What happened? Jared asked as he and the others woke up. The girl laughed, admitting she had been deceived by the seemingly naive young man. But it turned out that the seemingly naive young man named Shin actually knew how to use his ability to absorb contaminated mana. Interesting, the little girl said, apparently forming a new plan to face the naive young man who had deceived her while Shin moved away and joined the others, informing them that the little girl was actually the enemy in disguise. Since the little girl felt she was about to be beaten by a group of adults, she called her parents to come and help her. Soon after, the little girl's parents appeared from the sky and landed forcefully, causing the ground they stood on to tremble, and the little girl complained to her parents that she had been bullied by the uncles and aunts present. "Those people are bothering me, teach them a lesson," the little girl said. Jared didn't accept it, as the little girl had previously treated him improperly and tried to brainwash him. Jared immediately advanced and attacked the little girl along with her parents. "Who are they? I'll kill them all at once," Jared said. But his attack didn't hit the enemy, instead, it struck one of his own team members. The blow was so strong that one of his members was sent flying and hit something behind him. "Wow, what are you doing, Jared?" Craig said, confused because Jared attacked his own member. After further investigation, it turned out that Jared had been controlled by the little girl, and the one actually controlling him was the little girl's uncle, named Rowan. Also realizing something, Jared often said that his body suddenly felt pain, and Shin thought he had been fighting too hard before. It turned out that the pain was caused by mana contamination that had entered Jared's body first, and it was so thin that Shin hadn't suspected the existence of mana contamination in Jared's body at that time. That thin contamination was the little girl's opportunism. No one noticed it. Even Shin didn't suspect it earlier because Rowan's ability was to hide the presence of mana in Jared's body. This was indeed a complicated situation where you had to face your friends as enemies. Your friends had become puppets. "I'm curious about what will happen next," the little girl said. Craig immediately advanced and planned to stop and capture Jared. He also asked for help from the others. "Of course, with pleasure," said the girl with weapon skills. The fire was very pleased because she didn't like Jared's overly talkative nature before, and they launched attack after attack on Jared, and Jared deflected every attack coming at him. Suddenly, a strong ice shield appeared, covering Jared's body. One of Jared's members stated that it was a skill that activated when the guild master, Jared, felt a life-threatening danger. It was explained that the feeling couldn't be penetrated by any weapon and couldn't be disturbed for a certain period. Yes, it couldn't be disturbed, meaning the threads controlling him wouldn't work, and Rowan, who was hiding in Jared's body, would also be frozen, and Jared would remain frozen like that for the next few hours. This time, one side of the enemy couldn't help in the fight, meaning there were only 3 enemies left, the little girl and her parents, and the battle between the hunter group and the monster group was about to begin. "Finish them off as soon as possible," the little girl said. Craig could sense the energy from the 2 enemies was different from the puppets he had seen before. He thought that the 2 opponents this time, if you considered them to be at a sufficiently challenging dungeon level, equivalent to boss monster strength, would be too dangerous to ignore and bypass the 2 guardian puppets protecting the girl. There was only one choice that could be made, and that was the safest one, to face them directly. Even though Craig still felt that something was strange and that the girl seemed to be hiding something, this oddity was only a feeling Craig had. Nonetheless, Craig felt different, sensing that the girl appeared to be more than just someone who liked to be in control. After coming up with a plan, he finally informed his team and Jared's team to focus on attacking the female doll, while Craig himself would attack the male doll. Craig's intentions and preparations for the assault were suddenly interrupted as the male doll launched itself while Craig was also readying himself with flames emanating from his sword. Meanwhile, Shin did not participate in the attack because, from the beginning, he was part of the team as a weapons maker. As long as he performed his duties as a weapons maker, he was free to do anything as long as it was within the guild's rules, and what Shin was doing now was observing the enemy's skills that did not work on Jared. According to Shin, the enemy's abilities seemed flawed or like a game system that had issues, and those problematic events were now happening to Jared. While he was thinking about the enemy's ability to turn hunters into dolls, Shin still felt something was amiss. Yes, at the time, the transformation into a doll that happened to Jared occurred instantly, but it happened after Shin had managed to absorb all the contaminated mana from everyone through his mana absorption ability before Shin used his absorption ability, and when everyone, including Shin himself, was bound by threads of contaminated mana. Elizabeth should have had the opportunity to turn them all into dolls right then and there, but oddly, Elizabeth did not do so. Whether Elizabeth did not want to do it or actually could not do it remains unknown. Shin moved to the battle location with his weapon skills, and Yeren, with her ice ability, attacked simultaneously and directed their attacks at the female guardian doll, but the female doll easily withstood the two attacks directed at her. Returning to Shin, who was still trying to understand Elizabeth's abilities. According to Shin, if Elizabeth's reason was just to play around, that was unlikely. Also, why did Elizabeth even reveal herself and say that she deliberately stirred emotions in Craig and Jared, nearly causing a fight among the guild members? Another oddity was that Elizabeth also guided Shin to a scout who was previously declared missing. And not only that, Elizabeth even told Shin that the students were weaker than those who had been turned into dolls before. After gaining Shin's trust, Elizabeth quickly revealed her true intentions, making everything in vain. According to Shin, Elizabeth's actions were not those of someone who merely wanted to enjoy internal conflict among guild members, and the conclusion from all of Shin's thoughts was that Elizabeth seemed to be forced to fight against something. The battle they faced now was fierce, and Craig also felt that the male doll had very strong defenses. However, with the weapon Shin had made for him, Craig could freely channel his power into the sword and maintain a level of control during the battle with the doll. A woman with the ability to use firearms was ready to launch her signature move. She had loaded the bullets with magical rounds, then fired them, successfully hitting the female doll's body. The woman with the ability to use heavy weapons attacked two guardian dolls. They were eventually defeated, but one remained. Now, only Elizabeth was left as an enemy, although Craig was actually worried about the little girl's mental attacks because, for someone like Craig, mental attacks were very dangerous. However, for now, Craig was confident he could withstand such mental attacks. Therefore, Craig directly charged toward Elizabeth, and before Craig could actually break Elizabeth's neck, she left. It was as if she had been waiting for what was happening to happen. Hey, look, it's all in vain to worry that they are really great. Yeren also didn't expect that the enemy this time could be dealt with so easily. First of all, the enemy talked a lot and acted strong. According to Shin, if it ended easily like this, then that's good. However, Shin's previous assumption was that Elizabeth was forced by something to fight, and it turned out Elizabeth's goal was for them to be able to kill the two guardian dolls and kill herself, and all that had a reason. This moment was not a good moment but a very bad one where the hunters fell silent not because of magic or mental attacks but because something very shocking had happened that they had never experienced or faced in previous situations. There was a shocking presence, and Shin suspected that it was the secret boss of the old vampire, Elizabeth Badori, and at the same time, Shin's system also provided a mission, which was to defeat Elizabeth Badori, with a reward of control over the devil's shackles. Elizabeth was grateful that they had killed the dolls of her father and mother because Elizabeth had previously been betrayed by her parents and placed in the body of a weak child, and now she could be free for a moment. While holding back cold sweat, Yeren gave orders to the others to be prepared because, although Craig was very talented, if his opponent was such a monster, he would not be able to handle it alone. Elizabeth immediately began the battle. With her opening ability as the first course, she used the ability to drain essence. As a result, they vomited blood instantly. Yeren was shocked that a high-ranking undead like Elizabeth was adept at absorption-type magic. But given the distance and number of people present, Elizabeth could do it without any preparation. However, Craig did not stand still even though he was injured by Elizabeth's attack just now. Craig continued to launch an attack, but Elizabeth easily blocked and even destroyed Craig's sword with just one hand and then hit Craig so hard that he was thrown at high speed and stopped after crashing into the rocks behind him. Then Shin approached Craig and said that the output Craig was using now was not as strong as when Craig fought the previous spider monster boss. However, given the current conditions, Craig admitted that he could never produce a stronger output than that moment. Shin also showed something to Craig because, previously, Shin had gathered a lot of contaminated mana and stored it in a storage space. Now it was time for Shin to demonstrate his new ability. He would create a demon weapon that would consume contaminated mana points and become a weapon named the Demon Sword Leviathan. "Take this. It's your turn now," said Shin. In the previous story, Craig received the sword made by Shin. The name of the sword was the Demon Sword Leviathan. This sword was easy to grip and could provide various special abilities to its owner. The sword was powered by contaminated mana based on the energy Elizabeth sensed. According to her, it must be a special ability with a fire attribute, but Elizabeth did not feel panicked at all. Instead, she laughed happily. Then Elizabeth used her magic ability. After that, blood flowed, and the area where the blood was located was called. Shin was surprised because Elizabeth could use magic over a wide area. According to Shin, the magic was like absorption and sealing magic. Although the absorption power was not as much as Shin used before, it was still an ability that could be said to be versatile. It is said that this magic can paralyze the mana management and basic metabolism of its victims or targets. This ability will melt everything down to the bones, muscles, nerves, and veins, or it will pull the victim. However, after some time, the pain the victim feels will gradually diminish. Elizabeth was surprised when she saw that Craig could still move freely even though she had activated her ability. After thinking it over, Elizabeth realized that he was holding back something, meaning that even though he could move like that, his condition was not actually good. Yes, that's right, because Craig's movements were not of his own will and consciousness, but rather the ability of the sword. In fact, the strength Craig exerted was now stronger than before. For Elizabeth, this was not a big problem. Instead, it made her even more excited to destroy everyone in front of her. Craig quickly ran forward while Elizabeth prepared to use her blood magic ability. After that, a large blood-shaped hand appeared. Elizabeth immediately directed it at Craig, who was rushing toward her. Taehan easily slashed the blood hand with the Devil Sword Leviathan. What kind of power was that just mentioned? Elizabeth was surprised. According to her, that person's strength had at least doubled, maybe even more than doubled. Now, not only Elizabeth but even Shin himself was affected by Craig's current great power. Craig then slashed his sword again, cutting through the blood hand trying to protect Elizabeth. Elizabeth then attacked directly, seriously wounding her and leaving her powerless, unable to withstand the massive damage from Craig. At the same time, Shin managed to complete his mission while Elizabeth was helpless. Shin also received a reward from the system in the form of an item. Shin hoped to receive an item related to recovery or mana capacity. After that, Shin removed the Devil Sword Leviathan from Craig's grip, and the sword gradually became lighter. A notification then appeared, stating that the next time Shin used this ability, he wouldn't need to search separately and could manifest it directly. Meanwhile, Craig's hand was still trembling. Shin told him to calm down first because Shin knew Craig's condition, even though he was trying to stand. Craig still couldn't walk. But Shin was surprised that Craig could still maintain his consciousness after receiving massive damage from Elizabeth and using his ability with the great output from the Leviathan sword. Shin also told him to rest for a while and informed him that the lives of others were still safe, though they were unconscious. After that, Shin approached Elizabeth's body and found that she could still speak, even though her body was shattered and unable to move. Shin was confused as to why the system said that the red dungeon was cleared while Elizabeth was still alive. He was also puzzled that something was controlling that puppet. According to him, the puppet's mana was clearly the same contaminated mana he sensed from Elizabeth, even though Elizabeth herself did not have the ability to control puppets. However, the puppet still moved and prioritized protecting Elizabeth. Elizabeth responded that they indeed had to protect her because she was their valuable energy source, helping to protect them for a long time. In her past story, Elizabeth indulged them as she pleased, even though it was an action she should not have taken. At that time, Elizabeth saved them from the danger of monsters. At that time, Elizabeth felt there was something strange about them. They did not let Elizabeth, who had saved them, leave just like that. They invited her into their home. This was the beginning of Elizabeth feeling trapped. Elizabeth did not know when things started to change. Elizabeth was no longer considered a guest but as part of their family. Although this event felt short for Elizabeth, she felt very happy until she began to realize the reason why these people could accept her as their family. Elizabeth felt it was also her fault from the beginning for following those people, and also because Elizabeth gave them the chance to betray and control her from the first time they met. At the same time, this was proof that Elizabeth felt she had become soft and weak. That was Elizabeth's story of being trapped, and they placed her into a child's body. They also locked most of her abilities. Elizabeth could only provide the contaminated mana necessary to protect them. Protect them from what? Asked Shin, and Elizabeth answered that she was not sure either, but she thought the view outside the house was quite amazing, a vast, endless desert landscape. Elizabeth thought that the desert had no form and was not a natural desert but rather a space and protection created to protect the house. Elizabeth was sure that the person she considered a mother had used her power to create the desert. According to Elizabeth, the desert was likely created to protect them from the monsters across the rift. Seeing your reaction, your world must have rifts too, right? I think that's how you came here through the dimensional rift. According to Elizabeth, her world and Shin's world experienced some similar events, namely the appearance of rifts in the sky and humans becoming energy crews using mana, followed by the opening of gates one by one. Then, what emerged from these gates were monsters far more vicious than vampires like her. So how did your world deal with the disasters that emerged from those gates? How long did it take for the next gate to appear after the first one appeared? Shin asked urgently. Elizabeth replied that she had never seen the gates firsthand because, after being trapped in the body of a child, Elizabeth could not move at all in the darkness, and that's how the world survived. Elizabeth fell, and the world collapsed while Elizabeth herself was isolated and only recently became able to move. More precisely, Elizabeth was only able to move when a system appeared before her eyes. In this system, Elizabeth was given a mission. The mission was that Elizabeth had to expel the intruders who came from another world. In Elizabeth's system, there was information about the intruders. If she succeeded in completing her mission, she would be freed from the abandoned world. Elizabeth also knew that Shin still had many questions, but Elizabeth felt she couldn't answer all of Shin's questions because her time was almost up. Elizabeth's body began to cool and become younger. Shin realized that Elizabeth was like a player, just like him, but now Shin panicked because Elizabeth's body began to disintegrate. However, at that moment, Shin Sho's system appeared and told him that the shackles of devil control item could be used now. Shin tried to open the gift box and use the item. It was a forced dungeon item that could be used on monsters defeated in a critical condition. When successfully used, the monster would recover from the critical condition and become a subordinate of the player who used the item as a pet. Yes, Shin had seen many players with their pets, but this was the first time he made a player a pet, and Shin's system started creating a contract, and the contract succeeded. The vampire Elizabeth Bathory was registered as Shin's pet. However, Shin was surprised because he was actually not surprised that Elizabeth's form would change. Of course, he was surprised because Elizabeth did not turn into a bat that would suit being a vampire but instead turned into a cat. Even her collar was changed to fit a cat. But not long after that, Elizabeth was able to change back to her original form. Elizabeth was upset and didn't accept being turned into a pet, but maintaining human form was still too difficult for Elizabeth because Shin needed contaminated mana to maintain it. Finally, she returned to cat form at that moment. Elizabeth couldn't refuse to become Shin's pet. Although Elizabeth turned into a cat, she could still communicate with Shin. By the way, were you really betrayed by those people? Shin asked, seemingly knowing the truth that they didn't betray Elizabeth. What nonsense are you talking about? I have already told you everything. Yes, you don't need to repeat it again. I heard your story clearly. It's just that when I heard your story earlier, Shin felt something was wrong. Previously, Elizabeth said that they stole Elizabeth's power so they could survive. According to Shin, living like that was meaningless. Shin didn't know what actually happened, but in his opinion, Elizabeth's family didn't seem perfect. Even Shin wasn't sure if they had real feelings or rationality, but more like living beings to Shin. They were more like dolls moving with a cursed program, but for Elizabeth, nothing was strange about that. According to Elizabeth, human mentality was destined to change according to their physical bodies. They became like that because they were forced to use contaminated mana, becoming evil and losing their rationality. However, even if what Elizabeth said was true, Shin still wouldn't feel sorry for fools like Elizabeth's family because if they were Shin or most humans, they wouldn't choose to live like that. Then Shin approached the doll and said if it moved its body, it should have after getting what it was looking for. Then he called Elizabeth. Come here, said Shin, not thinking that such a simple command could not be refused. I don't know if you know or not, but this is an item called the Essential Crystal usually used for class spells affiliated with black magic and storing some mana and your soul into it. According to Shin, they took it and put it into the doll, bringing their souls into it but maybe they didn't have enough power. But clearly, they were skilled enough technically. Suddenly, Elizabeth was carried into the memories of her family, more precisely, it was her father's memories. At that time, her mother said she had seen several thousand different visions since a few days ago, but the results were always the same. In her mother's vision, the collision between two different worlds in recent years continued to increase in frequency and was out of control, and although they could delay it, according to her mother, it was too late to prepare for it. Then her father suggested using the different dimension hypothesis researched by Elizabeth's mother, because that way, her father thought at least their family could survive. Her mother replied that if Elizabeth helped them, they would at least be able to separate the land around the house. But according to her mother, another problem would come after that. The problem was that if their world was destroyed, then the house would float forever in the space between two dimensions until someone from the other world found them. And it could last several hundred or even several thousand years or even longer than that, and they could only wait to die slowly, according to her mother. They could only survive for a few years in the dimension that would be created, but according to the child, Elizabeth could last longer because she was not human like them. The child thought they could at least save Elizabeth in that dimension as well because their family could also live there. At that time, Elizabeth came to help them defeat the giant monster, and they thought that at least one family member should stay alive. However, they never explained this to Elizabeth at all because they feared Elizabeth would refuse if only she were to survive later. That's why the family locked Elizabeth into the body of a child so she could last longer. Then they placed their souls into dolls, and for a few years or even hundreds of years, they could still retain their human consciousness. But after that, they would slowly fade away. After years, they wouldn't remember who they were anymore and would become dolls forever. Even if the dimension was isolated, they didn't know what kind of variables or dangers might occur to them, and they would protect Elizabeth from those dangers. They didn't know how long it would take for them to do so until someone from another world took Elizabeth out of that dimension and saved her. They even said that if they told Elizabeth about this plan, she would refuse and would rather die with them. That is why they didn't tell Elizabeth, causing this misunderstanding to occur. Don't just sit there, get up, you don't have time wasted, said Shin, making a bet with Elizabeth, feeling confused. Then Shin also said that Elizabeth's original role was to end everything. According to Shin, the reason was that they had chosen to become dolls all this time just for Elizabeth, and all of it was to protect her. Therefore, Shin wanted Elizabeth herself to help and end their suffering, not someone else. But I can't do something like that, how can I? You know, if their doom and death were certain, they could have arranged everything and chosen to live happily at the end of their lives, but they chose not to. They locked and sealed themselves in an endless dungeon for you, in a future they themselves were unsure of. And this isn't for me or for you, at least that's what you can do for their sacrifice. After that, Elizabeth stood up, and yes, she still felt heavy. Elizabeth also still remembered her past with her family in the previous world and also when she was in this dungeon. Eventually, Shin moved to an area outside the dungeon. Not long after that, John's group also began to exit from there, and their lives weren't in depth despite their condition being full of wounds. She herself felt that she had been in the dungeon longer than usual. Due to complicated incidents, Shin eventually succeeded in persuading Elizabeth to leave the dungeon. All of this was because Elizabeth's family hoped that people from another world could take Elizabeth and save her from that dimension. What about this place? I will do my best here and stay alive. This is my duty, said Elizabeth, who also ended this part. Alright, let's continue to the next storyline. After Shin Sho and his group left the dungeon, Shin suddenly moved to Yaren's house at night. That day was a tiring day for him after entering the dungeon with Jared and the others. Not long after that, an uninvited guest arrived at his house. Yaren already knew the person, but what happened on a night like this? He came to her house, Yaren thought. It turned out he came to accompany Yaren, who was tired and missing him, saying he wanted to keep her company. Yaren drank as much wine as she could, but Yaren didn't easily believe that the person who came just wanted to accompany her drinking. There must be another intention. Yaren threatened the person and asked him to be honest about his purpose for coming. Then the person said that it was true he didn't come just for personal reasons. He also heard that Yaren had previously entered a dungeon whose difficulty level hadn't been confirmed. The person wanted Yaren to tell about what the adventure in such a dungeon was like. Yes, the person knew that Yaren couldn't answer the question because, in the middle of the battle in the dungeon, Yaren and part of her team were unconscious. Yaren reasoned that because the dungeon had conditions that suddenly became strange, and even though she was unconscious, Yaren believed her team would still win. It was said that Craig managed to defeat the boss monster with just 2 sword swings given by the support class, seen from the warrior's explosion. Yes, according to Yaren, it was an unprecedented power. Yes, the person knew that Craig was an S-rank hunter and thought that a strong hunter like him was worth targeting and hunting. Yaren also said that even though Craig seemed very impressive with his strength, there was one more person who needed to be confirmed first, the person from the support class who helped Craig initially. Yaren thought the supporter was just an ordinary low-class player who could only make general weapons, but the reality was that the weapons made by the supporter were different. They were able to withstand Craig's full strength. According to the person, if someone knows how to make a good sword, it would be very useful, yes, very useful for equipment. But for the person, a tool is a tool. If no one can hold and use it, then the tool would become useless. Craig's ability and support only exist at the 2 ends of a sword, and purity in battle is what the person thought of. Meanwhile, according to Yaren, if the person hunted Yan, then the weakness due to underestimation might be the main cause that would make him lose again. The person was a bit curious about the D-ranked support class person because he made Yaren acknowledge someone from the support class. Although the supporter wasn't as strong as Craig, the person intended to eliminate Yan and the supporter when the time came. A few days later, Shin moved to Shin's location. He slept for several days in a row, but his condition didn't improve, and this was due to Elizabeth's absorption ability. Then Shin intended to ask Elizabeth about this. Who knows, Elizabeth might know how to overcome the side effects Shin felt this time. After he called Beth several times, it turned out Beth never answered. Then Shin Sho realized something, which was that the window was open. Beth possibly went out through that window, but Shin wasn't worried about Beth because he could summon her by force anytime he wanted, and Beth possibly went out because she was curious about her new world. Shin just hoped Beth wouldn't do anything strange out there. In a treasure chest, there are random gifts given to players, but they are not always good. Nonetheless, the items given by the treasure chest are limited to what the owner needs. The problem lies in the drawbacks of the items given, such as a sharp and strong sword that can only be used for attacking and not for parrying. There is also a shield that can withstand attacks but will also reflect the impact of the attack on others, although very weakly. It gets even more extreme because there are many cases where people try to use the items they get from the chest only to end up hurting themselves. The only item Shin currently needs is something with the ability to restore mana or increase the total amount of mana. In fact, it was predictable what would come out when Shin opened it. A system notification appeared saying that the treasure chest was selecting an item for Shin, and the item Shin received was a ring called the Trader's Ruin. This item had the ability to drain mana and explained that the mana draining function would be proportional to the target's goodwill towards the user. However, Shin really didn't like such an item. Not long after Beth came home, she had finished walking outside the house. She saw Shin upset and angry. According to Shin, the item wasn't bad, and it could even be considered excessive, but the problem was the requirement. It had to make a good impression, even if the target was an enemy. Then, Beth greeted the annoyed Shin and told him that someone would be visiting Shin's house. Shin himself didn't know the name of that person. He just said that the person was Koplak, the guild leader. His name was Jared. He never expected a support class like Shin to live in an unsafe and unsuitable place, even though initially he thought Craig would place his support in a good location. "Oh yes, he really is a fool," Shin said. Who would have thought that the guest was Jared? Jared's purpose in coming was to recruit Shin directly after witnessing Shin's abilities firsthand. At that time, he knew that Shin had done something extraordinary for Craig, and the energy emitted by Shin was able to penetrate the barrier and reach Jared, albeit only for a moment. However, Jared himself didn't know why Shin was rank D, even though considering Shin's potential, he should be at least rank or even higher. Nonetheless, Jared still intended to recruit Shin, even though Shin had joined Gilonfon not long after he left. Shin just wondered how the game knew his address, but for the game, it didn't matter because, according to it, Shin should be impressed that a big guild had visited him. Even the game said, "You must be quite impressed that you came out to meet me like this, right?" But it turned out Jared was wrong because Shin didn't come out to meet Jared. That day was the renewal date for the work certificate for the support class. Jared realized that he had disturbed Shin when they were in the dungeon before because he always underestimated Shin, and now Jared offered 3 times what Craig offered. Jared even promised that Shin would receive the best treatment from anyone and anywhere if he wanted to join Jared. However, that didn't interest Shin at all. Shin immediately refused to join Jared's guild. Jared was very upset. Besides Shin, Jared had previously invited Yeren to join, but Yeren also declined. "Just wait and see, both you and Yeren, I'll make you both beg me later," Jared said angrily as he left. Shin accidentally bumped into someone's shoulder. Shin felt something when he noticed that the person's face resembled someone named Mjin. Shin was shocked to see Dojin in his second life. At this time, Shin moved to another place where he saw the gate to the dungeon opening. There was also a team of hunters preparing to conquer the dungeon. It was a high difficulty dungeon. In that team, as usual, Shin always joined as a supporter whose job was to assist the team and collect mana stones. Inside the dungeon, a woman looked very nervous because it was her first time entering a higher ranked dungeon. Then Shin calmed the woman because, in that team, there were experienced or veteran people, so as long as they followed instructions, there wouldn't be any major issues. Behind Shin, there was someone who seemed to dislike him. Coincidentally, that person was on this team, and that person was Moon Doyoon's younger brother, who was called Dojin. It had been years since Shin had been active as a hunter but had only about 1 year of experience, and Shin's experience began when he joined Moon Doyoon's Daewon Guild. At that time, he and his brother, Moon Doyoon, were talking about dungeon ranks. His brother chose to bid for a rank D dungeon, but Dojin felt that his brother's team was more suited for higher ranked dungeons. However, Moon Doyoon said that there was a possibility of getting a rank D dungeon with a wide scope and abundant resources, which could yield greater profits with minimal human resources, so big guilds usually targeted such dungeons. But it was different for a new guild like Moon Doyoon's Daewon Guild, where there were many things that could be done even though they and their team only got half of what they expected. With that, Moon Doyoon could strengthen the equipment of guild members who had worked hard and train them using special facilities without the help of other guilds, making him confident that his guild could grow into a big guild. But his desire couldn't be fulfilled. Dojin received difficult news from the association. Dojin received news saying that his brother had died in a rank D dungeon. even though as far as Dajin knew, his brother was a rank B hunter. However, the officer said that the dungeon Mon entered was unconfirmed, and the investigation showed it was very dangerous. At that time, Dajin felt that his brother's death wasn't an ordinary one, even though his brother previously said that he got the rank D dungeon gate through an auction, and according to his brother, Dajin felt it was impossible to lie about it. Moreover, his brother didn't say anything strange, so Dajin thought something happened beyond reason. At that time, Dajin was surprised that there was still one person who survived the dungeon so that they could evacuate his brother's and others' bodies. The only survivor at that time was Shin. That was Dajin's flashback. We return to the current situation before entering the dungeon gate. The person carrying the shield hoped that their team could complete the dungeon without any members getting hurt, while Dajin himself was still thinking about his brother's past, that his brother and all the veterans in the guild were dead. Dajin wondered how a rank D supporter could survive by luck. At that time, he wanted to think about how often this incident felt strange to him, and Dajin's current goal was to find out the truth about his brother's death because, according to Dajin, Shin had something to do with his brother's death. After Shin's group entered, suddenly, the officer saw someone who had just arrived. The officer stopped the man because, apart from team participants, it was forbidden to enter the dungeon. Yes, he was the man who was previously at Yaren's house. He handed a piece of paper to the officer stating that he had permission to enter the dungeon until finally, the officer allowed the man to enter. The man was tasked by his leader, and that task was to deal with Dajin. "Let's see the true abilities of this potential hero," he said. A few moments inside the dungeon, Dajin managed to summon the head of a duck, which had a high danger level. The uncomfortable man seemed overwhelmed by the duck monster. Dajin himself was also surprised, even though the dungeon they entered was rank C, but according to his assessment, it could be said to be equivalent to a rank B dungeon or higher. Initially, Dajin wanted to hide his strength, but because he was really strong, he eventually released his true power and managed to defeat the monster. The man felt grateful because, as it turned out, there was a talented person like Dajin in his group. Dajin replied that he only helped a little because the monster had already been weakened by others, even though the others were not in good shape now. Unfortunately, in this dungeon, Dajin didn't bring the equipment he usually used because his initial intention was only to disguise himself so he could follow Shin to gather information about his brother's death. It seemed like, if you need a new weapon, I can make one for you if you agree to forget about my ability once we get out of the dungeon, said Shin. Suddenly, he felt that the weapon made by Shin was superior to the one he didn't bring. The power and weight of the weapon were incredible. Dajin never thought that a support class like Shin could make such a weapon. In fact, he could make it in an instant. "Hey, Jill, are you ready?" said Dajin, who was still hiding his identity. Shin was confused. Shin should have been the one to ask, because as far as he remembered, he never mentioned his name, but the person already knew Shin's name. Only then did Dajin remove his hood and introduce himself. Actually, Dajin didn't care about Shin's identity because he only wanted Shin to tell him what happened to his brother. He had just finished speaking when suddenly there was an attack aimed at Dajin, but fortunately, he was able to block it in time. The attack wasn't from a monster but from a man targeting Dajin. The man didn't expect Dajin to withstand his attack while others were already helpless. It turned out that Shin was also hit by the attack, but he also managed to withstand the man's attack. Dajin didn't know where the man came from, but clearly, the man's power was really very strong. Besides being talented, this man was much stronger than him, Dajin thought. The man also realized that the support person in this team was Shin. Shin was also his target. "Does that person know Shin?" said Dajin, still confused about what was happening. Without further ado, the man immediately released his ability to try to see how talented his target was and launched an attack on Dajin. Dajin felt that he could only withstand 2 to 3 more attacks. After that, he wouldn't be able to withstand such powerful attacks. All Dajin could do in a situation like this was to defend and find a way to counterattack. "Damn, the other supporter is really useless," said the man, seeing Shin just standing still and doing nothing. However, how surprised the man was when his entire body suddenly couldn't move because he was entangled by threads released by Elizabeth Ha. "This is 3 against 1, said Shin and Elizabeth simultaneously. However, because currently there was no contaminated mana stored, Shin's stamina or mana would be drastically drained, and Elizabeth Bathory would only last a few seconds. According to Shin, a few seconds were more than enough to end this difficult battle. Soon after, the man was able to move his body and immediately attacked Elizabeth, but Elizabeth easily dodged the attack using her ability with the mist. Then Elizabeth said, "Too bad an attack with pure physical strength is not scary at all. Even though you seem the same as that person, there is a slight difference in level. I'm sure your weapon is also part of that, and soon you will die at my hands." But after that, Dajin immediately advanced and managed to launch an attack that cut off one of the man's arms while Elizabeth herself disappeared because the 2-second time limit was up. In Dajin's mind, he thought that killing the man was too difficult, but at least he could severely injure the man. Nevertheless, Dajin still felt there was a huge difference in basic skills between himself and the man. Generally, lowering a sword was a clear act of surrender, but Dajin immediately knew that the man had another intention. The man used Shin's contaminated mana ability until he was surprised that this person could use contaminated mana. While Dajin didn't let the man carry out another plan, Dajin immediately attacked and managed to launch a direct hit, but it turned out that the attack missed the target because the target used teleportation circle magic and disappeared. According to Shin, it was a relief because the enemy only used an item to escape, because if the enemy had used an attack type item at that time, Dajin wouldn't have survived. After that, Shin would tell Dajin about what happened a year ago. According to Shin, Dajin, Gildawan, and Dajin's older brother deserved to know. In short, it was already afternoon. Shin and Dajin had left the dungeon while evacuating the victims. Actually, Dajin felt bad, even though those people had been killed by that crazy bastard, but Dajin had to lie and say that they were killed by monsters in the dungeon. The reason Shin and Dajin had no other choice was because the security officer's data for this team only contained 7 members. Then, a few minutes after entering, it was said that someone with an access card entered through the gate with too late a runway. The unbelievable thing actually happened. The certificate was forged well enough to fool the security officer. As Shin previously told Dajin, it was the same as the incident a year ago, where an unconfirmed dungeon was openly offered at an auction as a dungeon that received a permit and was certified by Shin himself. Shin didn't know their purpose, but according to him, an issue like this wasn't something a small group could do. There was a possibility that the perpetrator was a large group. The perpetrator might be an important figure who wouldn't be caught even after deceiving coworkers. There was another possibility that the perpetrator was someone big enough that it didn't matter if they got caught because maybe some of them couldn't accept it. In other words, if Dajin officially reported it to the association, then those people might get hurt. That's what Shin meant. But Dajin still had one more question, which was about Shin's ability. Shin was rumored to be an RD supporter, but for Dajin, it didn't make sense. "Why are you hiding your abilities?" Dajin asked. Shin replied that if he explained in detail, it would take too long. However, a year ago, Shin's abilities were completely useless to him, only able to create 1 or 2 swords, which earned him the nickname Ranged, and it was embarrassing for him. But when he was on the brink of death in an unconfirmed dungeon a year ago, Shin awakened with his new abilities and, thanks to that, he was the only one who could survive. To some people, it might seem unrealistic, and Shin understood that it might sound suspicious. Even if Shin were in Dajin's position, he might not believe it. However, if one day the main perpetrator and the truth behind it could be revealed by Shin, then he plans to disclose everything to the world and the family members of the victims who fell victim to the incident a year ago. Nevertheless, Shin feels guilty because he is still hiding the truth until now. Shin apologizes and says that if one day he can find the culprit responsible for Moon Do-yoon's death and the others, then find them. Do not act as if this is only your problem and forget the fact that you are not the culprit. There isn't a single answer I can accept, Dajin said. Because Dajin now feels that his position and condition are no different from Shin's after the dungeon incident earlier. Although Dajin has seen the truth with his own eyes, he has to keep his mouth shut to those who deserve to know it. Dajin will never stop until he makes those who killed his brother pay the price. Dajin also intends to catch them no matter what. Now Dajin will side with Shin until he can find the culprit. From now on, Dajin hopes that he and Shin can rely on each other and help one another. Then Shin moved to the man's place. He seemed upset and was about to hit someone he called mother. Then a woman appeared. The woman said she didn't know why the man was upset and said he was going to hit the mother when he lost and fled. According to the woman, it was very sad to see him. Even according to the woman, it would be better if the man came back dead or still alive but in despair. That way, the woman could make the man her victim. But unfortunately, someone still expects a lot from the man, even though the woman doesn't know why. Then the woman released something terrifying right in front of the man. Don't resist. Eat that child, and it will become your new arm, the woman said. However, the man was cautious because he wouldn't take something he considered foreign and eat it just like that. The woman laughed. She understood because she and the man didn't have a trusting relationship with each other. However, the woman wasn't sure if the man could use a sword again with a broken arm like that. But if he wanted to eat that thing, then the man could do whatever he wanted. Eventually, the man ate the terrifying thing. After eating it, the reaction happened very quickly. The woman didn't expect the man to be compatible with the thing she gave him. It was the first form for now. If the man used it after some time had passed, he would automatically find a more suitable form. If you don't like it, just say it anytime. You understand? That child is like my child, the woman said. Now the man felt he could do whatever he wanted, and his main goal was to kill everyone, starting with the witch in front of him, then Moon Dajin, the woman who used threads in the dungeon, and also Shin. They were all his targets to kill.